Go on.
Everybody should be treated on an equal basis.
Inequality is driving poverty, crime,
racism, classism,
inequalities in education, job opportunities.
They are all interconnected.
Inequality for me is a call to action.
We need systemic solutions
to create opportunity and justice and fairness for everyone.
Inequality is a two-way street. My equality is tied to your equality.
Justice, it means different things in different contexts for me personally. It can mean retribution.
It's to create fairness.
A belief about how things should be in the world.
Well, we are expected to apply the laws of science to the laws of man.
You want to be the person that is able to balance the scale.
And I've still yet to find a definite answer, and I'm still searching.
Welcome to the American Justice Summit. We are about to begin, so please take your seats and silence all electronic devices. Flash photography is not permitted in the theater. Thank you.
There's been another mass shooting in America. Thoughts and prayers are not enough.
Gun violence is the leading cause of death for African American males ages 15 to 24.
Our nation now has the greatest number of prisoners of any country in the world.
There are more children in this country who have a parent behind bars than who have a parent who don't employ.
The NYPD police officer won't face criminal charges.
Hell no. The time for remorse would have been when my husband was yelling to Preet.
I swear that the testimony before about
Welcome, everybody, to the second annual American Justice Summit. It's an honor to be back at the renowned Center for Justice Education and Scholarship, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, so brilliantly led by my co-host, President Jeremy Travis. And welcome, too, to everybody watching us on Vice News. When we first gathered here last year, it was to understand how the United States model of freedom and democracy had come to incarcerate more of its citizens than any other nation in the world, a shocking 2.3 million Americans. It was clear then, has been for years, that we needed profound reform. And now it's beginning to happen. We have truly entered a moment in criminal justice history. Just this week, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that inmates serving life in prison for murders they committed as teenagers have the right to seek new sentences or parole. On Monday, President Obama announced plans to expand mental health treatment in federal prisons and ban solitary confinement for juvenile offenders. And there's just been this steady drumbeat all year. Groups across the political aisle, from the ACLU to Freedom Works and Koch Industries, are working together to reduce prison populations, reduce recidivism, and reform sentencing guidelines. There's bipartisan backing for a bill in Congress that would loosen mandatory minimum sentencing laws at last. And how good was it to hear the words criminal justice reform coming from the lips of many presidential candidates, even last night? All this is testament to reformers and legislators who worked so hard to reverse the trends. Many of you are here today, and many of you will speak on stage from head and from heart. Let's give them all a hand now. Still, there have been shocks this year to dramatize the scope of the challenges. The list of people who've died through contact with the police has grown, further fraying the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. We know their names: Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Philip White, Betty Jones, just some of the heartbreaking losses. We're very honored today that Sandra Bland's mother and sister, and that Betty Jones's nephew, flew in from Chicago to speak with us. And we also welcome Vanita Browder, mother of Kalief, who suffered so cruelly in Rikers Island before he took his own life. The senseless scourge of gun violence, for which we have a million excuses and zero action, has been appalling. According to the Gun Violence Archive, in 2015 alone, guns killed at least 13,370 Americans, among them 330 innocents who died in mass shootings. We welcome today Sandy Phillips, whose daughter Jessie perished in the 2012 attack on the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado by James Holmes. These are among the issues on our agenda today, and how we respond to them as a nation will define our values as Americans. We can't get anywhere without practical understanding, clearly, so we're fortunate to be able to draw on the experiences of leaders that are joining us today, such as former Attorney General Eric Holder, U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, and the amazing performance artist and philanthropist, Usher. We'll hear from many other compelling voices, too, from Dean Strang, the defense attorney we've come to know from Netflix's Making a Murderer, to Brittany Packnett, the fiery activist of Black Lives Matter. I applaud the public-spirited organizations that have come together to support the American Justice Summit today. I'd like to acknowledge with thanks our generous leadership sponsors, the Ford Foundation and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, our host. Our supporting sponsor, Thomson Reuters, and our accomplished and capable partners, Just Leadership USA, the Marshall Project, Vice News, and WNYC. And thank you, my brilliant co-hosts who've dedicated so much time and thought to this gathering. Pamela Thomas-Graham, Credit Suisse's Chair of New Markets, Darren Walker, President of the Ford Foundation, and of course, Jeremy Travis, who's helped us understand how incarceration impacts lives far beyond prison walls. Thanks to all of you. And now let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Beatty.
There are an estimated 2.8 million children of incarcerated parents in this country. This poem is a part of their story. This poem is a part of my story. It is called Knock Knock. As a boy, I shared a game with my father. We played it every morning till I was 3. He would knock on my door and I'd pretend to be asleep till he got right next to the bed. Then I would get up and jump into his arms. Good morning, Papa. And my papa, he would tell me that he loved me. We shared a game, knock, knock, to that day when the knock never came. And my mama takes me on a ride past cornfields on this never-ending highway till we reach a place of high, rusty gates. A confused little boy entered the building carried in my mama's arms, knock, knock. Reach a room of windows and brown faces. Behind one of the windows sits My father, I jump out of my mama's arms and run joyously towards my papa's, only to be confronted by this window. I knock, knock, trying to break through the glass, trying to get to my father. I knock, knock as my mama pulls me away before my papa even says a word. And for years, he has never said a word. And so years later, I write these words for the little boy in me who still awaits his papa's knock. Papa, come home because I miss you. Miss you waking me up in the mornings and telling me you love me. Papa, come home because there's things I don't know, and I thought maybe you could teach me how to shave, how to dribble a ball, how to talk to a lady, how to walk like a man. Papa, come home because I decided a while back I want to be just like you, but I'm forgetting who you are. And years later, a little boy cries, and so I write these words, and I try to heal, and I try to father myself, and I dream up a father who says the words my father did not. Dear son, I'm sorry I never came home. For every lesson I failed to teach, hear these words. Shave in one direction with strong, deliberate strokes to avoid irritation. Dribble the page with the brilliance of your ballpoint pen. Walk like a god, and your goddess will come to you. No longer will I be there to knock on your door, so you must learn to knock for yourself. Knock, knock down doors of racism and poverty that I could not. Knock, knock on doors of opportunity for the lost brilliance of the black men who crowd these cells. Knock, knock with diligence for the sake of your children. Knock, knock for me, for as long as you are free, these prison gates cannot contain my spirit. The best of me still lives in you. Knock, knock with the knowledge that you are my son, but you are not my choices. Yes, we are our father's sons and daughters, but we are not their choices. For despite their absences, we are still here, still alive, still breathing, with the power to change this world, one little boy and girl at a time. Knock, knock, who's there? We are.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
We intend to do what is necessary to end the drug menace and to eliminate this dark, evil enemy within.
They should go to jail and stay in jail.
3 strikes and you are out.
The president says gun violence can no longer be ignored.
So no, I don't blame the gun. I blame the guy that was holding the gun.
The horror erupting across Baltimore, the city erupting in rock-throwing, rubber bullet shooting chaos.
Waves of unaccompanied children, 52,000 of them so far.
He's deported more people than any other president in our nation's history.
Ohio voters will say no to legalizing recreational marijuana.
The president wants to make it easier for ex-inmates to find jobs.
Good morning. I'm John Avalon, editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, and honored to be kicking off the opening panel of the American Justice Summit with an extraordinary group, and we're going to have, I think, a very substantive conversation with Yale professor Stephen Carter, author and columnist. Greg Marcantelli is the cabinet secretary of the New Mexico Corrections Department, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, Democrat of Hawaii, and filmmaker Andrew Jarecki. So we've got a broad spectrum of voices, personalities, and perspectives this morning. But Congressman, I'd like to begin with you. Criminal justice reform is having a rare moment. For so often, it's been on the back burner of the American consciousness. And it's the one thing that President Obama, Ted Cruz, Bernie Sanders, and Paul Ryan all theoretically agree on. So, as we begin a new calendar year, tell me there's any hope that if there's that kind of consensus, we can actually see legislation get done.
There is hope.
There's hope. Is there more than hope?
That's the takeaway that I hope we all walk away from this on. This has been a painful issue for so many for such a long time, and in politics it's so rare that you have people on such divergent sides of the political spectrum gathering together with one united voice saying criminal justice reform must happen, and it must happen now. How often do you have the ACLU partnering up with the Koch brothers to move a substantive policy forward? How often do you have Van Jones and Newt Gingrich partnering up and saying our voices are united on this urgent change that's absolutely necessary. So it's going to be tough. It's a presidential election year, but I do have hope.
Put your realist hat on for 1 second, handicap it for me. Honest to God, what % chance do you think is that we'll see legislation, or is it just going to be kicked to the next president?
Look, I think the fact that, as you mentioned, Speaker Paul Ryan and the President in his State of the Union both have talked about criminal justice reform, I think that the odds are more in our favor that we might actually get some legislation through this year. Saying that, though, I think it's important for us all as a community and leaders across the country to recognize that this is not going to be the solution by any means. It will be one step forward, and we've got to turn up the heat to make sure that it gets done and that more comes to follow.
Well, that's more optimistic than I thought. I appreciate that. Greg, you have a perspective of running and representing a prison system. And one of the things that you've been very focused on is trying to move the focus of incarceration to rehabilitation from a vision of pure punishment. We are 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's incarcerated people. Is there buy-in from the justice community of this vision, or is this effort that you're trying to enact in your prisons in New Mexico facing real cultural, bureaucratic resistance?
Well, thanks for the question, and I think it's really relative to what the Congresswoman said, because I believe that when we're talking about reform, it has a logical flow to it, right? And we have to start with what we know, and then we make these small gains, and then we move the chains and we call in another play. And for me, in New Mexico, and the way that we've looked at trying to drive the reform there, I believe in all my heart that if we're able to reform our system at its deepest levels, that's why we started with segregation, then all other reforms just naturally become easier.
And by segregation, you mean solitary?
Solitary, segregation, restrictive housing, any and in all of the terms. But what we're talking about is holding people in environments that don't necessarily come with what should be more congregal movement and programming.
All right, Stephen, one of the things that we've discussed, and obviously I think we're having a deeper conversation about race and class and the justice system in the country right now, a deeper conversation than we've had in a long time perhaps. But to what extent do you think, especially in the wake of the shootings that we've seen, that we are beginning to confront a deeper structural racism in the justice system? And beyond confronting it, what can be done about it? Give us some specifics that you think could help begin to turn the tide.
I'd certainly like to think we're beginning to confront it. A lot of the issues we see, the killings of young black men, to the water in Flint, we see all over the country and in many places around the world, we see the fruits of a structure in which for generations, people are taught black is on the bottom and white is on the top. And we all like to be self-congratulatory and say, we don't feel those things, everybody else may, but the structure is there. And the most vital work that we have to do, suppose that we're able to structure the criminal justice system in a way that fewer young black men are arrested or fewer have confrontations with the police, and we release more inmates. Then where do they go? They go back to the community where they won't be able to get a job, where they'll face all the same suspicions that they did before. That unless we think of these problems as part of a larger whole, as the need to confront and overcome these vicious lies about white superiority and black inferiority, we simply won't be able to make the progress we should make, despite all the wonderful intentions on this panel and in this room, despite the best will in the world. If we don't confront these forces, then we're simply not going to be able to make the progress that we should.
Is that education or legislation in your mind?
Some of it is legislation, to be sure. Some of it is education. Some of it is things like providing jobs and infrastructure reform and all the things that candidates like to talk about and they can never afford when the time comes. But there's more to it also. A group that I'm affiliated with, the Community Healing Network, is involved with trying to help healing within the black community from the enormous damage these lies have done that we see in all the data we look at every day, so that we can go out and confront and I hope overturn these lies. It's a psychic, emotional process as much as it is a process involving legislation, as much as it is a process involving education.
Andrew, we have discussed And this is going to be a multilateral response to really confronting this crisis. And part of the role with our politics is the press, is the media writ large. And one of the fascinating things we've seen on this issue is documentaries like yours, capturing the Friedmans and the Jinx, and really phenomenons like Serial and now Making a Murderer, drawing the kind of attention to specific cases that they might never would have gotten before. And it's fascinating because it's a combination of journalism and entertainment and filmmaking, or podcast in the case of Serial. Is this something that is a new vanguard of melding public policy and entertainment? And is this a role that media can play that perhaps our legislators and educators cannot?
It's a good question. I think that if you see the phenomenon of these documentaries and true crime stories where they kind of meld the public's fascination with the salacious crimes with some idea of justice reform, I think I'm reminded of this quote that somebody said recently. It was a defense attorney who said, if you have a client who's been wrongfully convicted and you want him to get his case to have a second look, go out and get a documentary filmmaker to make a movie about him. What's unfortunate about that is, it cost, I don't know, $7 or $8 million to make the Jinx. It cost, some number of millions of dollars to make Capturing the Friedmans. It's a little depressing to imagine that the way to get justice in the United States is to go out and find somebody who is to start with crimes that are salacious enough that you can make a movie about them and that people will find the twists and turns of it interesting. And then secondly, raise enough money that you ought to be able to get 5,000 people to have conviction reviews, but in fact you're just doing it for one sorry soul who's somewhere and locked up. So it's unfortunate that it's the case, but it is the case that you need something more to highlight your case than just injustice or just the fact that, I mean, if you look at this at these cases, and I think Making a Murderer is a great example. You watch that show, and every few minutes you're struck by that lawyer Strang is a genius. That guy's as good as you could possibly imagine. And the prosecutor is still going to withhold information. They're still not going to pursue anybody else for the crime, and there's no and the outrage doesn't come until much, much, much later when the American people see it and say, "Oh, can you believe this kind of thing happens?" When in fact it happens every day. You'd be just as outraged by the number of young black males who come into court and don't have proper representation, and you just can't make a movie about each one of them.
Yeah. Well, look, if we can educate while entertaining, I think that's how you win the court of public opinion, obviously. But Greg, one of the things I think Andrew's getting at is when these stories are simply happening to the other, right? When we ignore the individual instances, it becomes very easy to ignore the deeper problem. When we elevate an individual, we feel moral outrage. You've done a lot of work on solitary confinement, and as Tina mentioned earlier, the president just signed a law earlier this week, I suppose, on juvenile solitary. You yourself spent some time in solitary, and I think we've got some photos of this sort of immersive experiment you did. But tell me what you took away from that, and why you believe that solitary is overused and cruel and unusual, and certainly with the family of Kalief Browder here, I think people feel that, the injustice of forgetting about people, putting them in a hole for 23 hours a day, and calling it justice.
Well, let me qualify something. 48 hours, just to make sure it's well understood, 48 hours in that environment is but a pebble of sand on the beach relative to how we have overused this particular correctional management tool for many years. And I think that the reason we have, and I can tell you at least for New Mexico, in the over 3 decades that followed that tragic riot we had in 1980, our single view of success for our prisons became quiet prisons. We never, ever wanted the dubious distinction of another riot again. And so we put all of our time and talent behind making sure that we had incident-free, quiet prisons. And as a result of that, well, what we were doing was releasing people straight from those environments into our neighborhoods. And ladies and gentlemen, then we would sit back as prison officials and scratch our heads and wonder why they reoffended in our communities. and we weren't owning up to our responsibility. So in doing this, it was important for me because I came from over 3 decades of police work. I'm not a corrections guy. Probably still know just enough about corrections to get myself in trouble, to be honest with you. But the truth of the matter is that in my police career, having spent most of it in homicide, I knew that I had to go to those scenes and I had to feel, I had to taste, I had to experience, I had to smell those scenes to be able to better solve that complex problem. And so with all the disadvantages that I brought to the prison system when I was appointed to this position, I knew that if we were going to get our hands around this problem, that it had to become deeply personal for me, because I don't know about you all, but for me, every change in my life has always been driven by a very deep, personal, heartfelt position that I've had in my life. And so it was really important for me to get in there and experience it and begin I think the progress leaning into really taking a look at ourselves in that prison system and being willing to kick ourselves in our seats and make some changes.
And Congresswoman, Greg just mentioned the recidivism rate, which is such a huge problem, and it goes to the heart of whether we treat prisons as a place for rehabilitation and therefore back prison reform, or whether we view it simply as crime and punishment and throw away the key. Right. You've been a passionate supporter of kind of an inversion of the model we've used for decades, which began in Hawaii, called HOPE, and you're pushing a federal version of that right now. Tell us a little bit about it, because it's definitely a form of tough love, but it has a flexibility that puts the emphasis on rehabilitation rather than punishment.
That's exactly right. The HOPE program was started by a judge in Hawaii because he saw this problem of these increasing recidivism rates. And in short, basically, it's a very, very intense form of supervised probation. And the impact that we've seen in my home state of Hawaii is that 55% of those who go through this program are not rearrested, and 72% of those who go through the program don't return to any kind of drug use or abuse. We've seen this program now replicated in a number of other states very successfully, and now trying to see how we can implement this as a solution at the federal level. But similarly, there are a number of other community-driven solutions that are coming from folks who are recognizing the challenge within their community and trying to do something about it. I just want to mention one thing on Andrew's tool in telling stories and what Greg said about touching and seeing and feeling this experience, because this is all tied in together to how do you build the political will to be able to affect this change. Right. And while every single American may not go through this experience, either personally or may not be impacted directly by a family member, it's by hearing and seeing and being moved by these stories that are symbolic of the stories of far too many people, that start people calling my office and other members of Congress and other leaders saying, hey, what are you doing about this? What are you doing to fix this problem, to right this wrong? And that's where I think the power in each of these different elements is important to highlight.
It's consciousness raising, it's public pressure. Stephen, one of the dynamics that created a context we now call mass incarceration was, of course, the crime wave epidemic in the late 80s and 90s. And, I remember you writing about that at the time. New York City, for example, suffered 6 murders a day. Now we have less than 1. There's been a sea change. And a lot of that has been in the wake of the 1993 crime bill, which President Clinton championed, and which has subsequently become politically very contentious. His wife sort of backing off, in her campaign for the presidency. Is this context been created by the crime bill, or was there a unintentional or intentional structural racism to the crime bill, do you believe? Or is this simply a matter of reforming a previous era's reform? That it had a positive effect, gun violence is down across the country, but now we need to deal with the unintended consequences, which are themselves unjust.
Well, that's a great 6 or 7 part
Sorry about that.
question. But actually,
incredibly smart.
I want to start just with a very quick quibble with the premise of the question.
Okay.
It's very commonly said that this mass incarceration begins, in a sense, after the crime wave, in the crime wave of the 1980s. What you see, the incarceration rates start to skyrocket in the 1970s. Ronald Reagan declares the war on drugs in 1983, 84-ish. So you see the crime wave rising first. And it's really important to think about why it's raising. What happens in America between 1954 and 1984? In 1954, black unemployment was lower than white unemployment in every age group. In 1984, black unemployment has quadrupled. It's higher than white unemployment by a huge margin in every age group. This isn't a very hard thing to trace. And so,
why is that? Just so I understand.
The usual explanation for this, and I think it's a reasonable one, is that the jobs left the cities. The jobs left the cities, and I don't mean this in a personal way. White people left the cities, moved to the suburbs.
White flight manufacturing.
The cities were left with no jobs and with often very inferior services of a variety of kinds. And it's really interesting. You see now it's become very hip to move back to the cities. These young people, even the cities that we think aren't doing well, say Detroit, the young people moving back to the cities. I think that's a good thing.
It is.
That is going to help, I hope, with a kind of transformation. But just very briefly on the last part of the question about, so when the crime bill was passed under the Clinton administration originally, I mean, I think that in fairness to President Clinton, he's operating on a lot of different, under a lot of different pressures at once, and it's easy for us to forget that there was enormous perception at the time that crime was very high, even though crime had actually already started declining. It had been declining since the late 80s. What's striking today is that crime has declined enormously, violent crime in particular, and drug crimes have declined as well. And yet incarceration is still at sky-high levels. So instead of thinking about unintended consequences, whose fault it is, the important thing is just decide what to do about it. What's the best thing to do now? That was a policy that seemed like a good policy 20 years ago, 23 years ago, and the question is, what's the right policy in 2016?
And is judicial discretion a key part of that? That part of that crime, get it tough on crime wave of legislation was mandatory minimums, which ended up tying judges' hands in effect, where you get people who are broadly associated with a crime and thrown away for years.
Yeah.
I admit to mixed feelings about judicial discretion, because on the one hand, there's a part of me that wants to say, well, these mandatory minimums are terrible. They're tearing apart our cities. There's another part of me that wants to say, on the other hand, if you're a judge, especially in a city, you tend to see reoffenders. You see the same people again and again and again. And a lot of judges will tell you that they themselves become very cynical. And maybe, so if you take away the mandatory minimums, or rather you take away the sentencing guidelines and let the judges decide for themselves, I'm not sure that's going to solve the problem either, because we don't know what the judges actually are going to do.
Right. Tulsi, you have a specific story. You brought a woman to the State of the Union. It's an extraordinary story.
Stephen was talking about unintended consequences of these policies. I recently met a woman named Kemba Smith who was sentenced to 24.5 years in prison as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. She was dating and going out with a guy who was a drug dealer with no possibility of early release or parole. 24.5 years. She was in her early 20s. She gave birth in prison, had her son taken away from her just a couple of days after she gave birth. She ended up serving 6.5 years of this sentence, received clemency from President Clinton, who recognized at that time the girlfriends and the wives of those who were drug dealers, who were being charged with essentially this broad umbrella of conspiracy charges, and largely because of some of these mandatory minimums, receiving these draconian sentences for crimes, frankly, that they didn't commit. So now after her release, she's been dedicating her life to advocating for criminal justice reform and really being a voice for the many women who are still incarcerated because of these unintended consequences.
And Andrew, we're beginning to have a conversation about abuse of power, particularly often with police misconduct. But as your films have illustrated, prosecutorial misconduct is often as big a problem, because there is a lack of accountability. There is a who will watch the watchman type phenomenon. And I wonder if you just discuss that a bit, because the penalties, even when there's been demonstrated prosecutorial misconduct on cases where people have been ultimately exonerated, are virtually non-existent.
It would be helpful to play this little clip.
We've got a clip from one of your films, so we can throw that up. Yep.
Yeah, I think that'll be illustrative. if it's possible to do it.
A prominent middle-aged teacher in a prosperous Long Island town is charged with sodomizing young boys who were his students.
18-year-old Jesse Friedman also stands accused of sex abuse.
Charges are that while running a computer school, Arnold Friedman and his son engaged in various forms of sexual abuse against minor children.
It's definitely the worst crime that I've seen since I've been a prosecutor in 1973.
You are a menace to society and should not be released early, but should serve the maximum amount of time.
Jesse Friedman spent 13 years in prison after being convicted of sexually abusing more than 12 kids. But after he finished his sentence, a court ruled that his guilty plea was most likely coerced.
A shocking twist. A federal appeals court concluded that there's a reasonable likelihood that Jesse Friedman was wrongfully convicted. The appeals court did call on the Nassau DA's office to review the case all over again.
So, Andrew, put that in context for us about the issue of prosecutorial misconduct.
Well, there are a couple things about that clip that are kind of amazing. The guy with the sort of frizzy gray hair who says this is the worst crime I've seen in my 20x years as a prosecutor, that's the district attorney, right? So he's the most senior law enforcement official in this particular case. He was in Long Island in Nassau County. So here you have somebody going on television who is already judging the crime before there's ever been a trial, right? There's no compunction about going on television and saying, as a chief law enforcement officer, I realize no evidence has been shown and nobody's been able to present any kind of defense, but I just want to let you know this is the worst crime ever. In this particular case, these crimes, in my view, didn't happen at all. This was part of this sort of late, this is kind of that 1980s sex abuse kind of mass hysteria crime wave that was epitomized by the McMartin case. So to me, this issue that prosecutors get to go on television and talk about how terrible the crimes are is indicative of a much bigger problem, which is that there are about 2,330 prosecutors in the United States who have the most broad discretion of anybody in law enforcement. They decide which cases go to trial, which cases get pursued to begin with. And I think that we need if this is a memo to the next president, I think we need a renewed focus on the fact that absolute power corrupts absolutely. There are a lot of good prosecutors out there who would like to do the right thing, who would like to not be judged just by their conviction rate and how tough they are on crime. It would be nice to be in a world where people start to be judged much more on the fairness of the system that they put into place rather than just on the harshness of the system.
I appreciate that segue. So now let's briefly do our memo to the next president. On the issue of criminal justice reform, Congresswoman, what's the one thing you would like to see the next president do on this front?
Make sure that these reforms are actually passed and implemented because of the huge impact that they have on our community in three major areas. The impact that they have on our society, the impact that we have on having so many people who are becoming a part of this criminal class, the high recidivism rates, the lack of transition for folks who have served their time for the crime that they committed and who are going back to re-enter the community and who are now stuck with this for so long. The economic impact, the cost of our state spending over $50 billion a year to incarcerate our citizens. And lastly, the human impact, the impact on our families, for those whose family member or loved one gets shipped to a prison that's out of state, they lose contact with their family, and the impact that has. These impacts are felt deeply by families all across the country, and this change is long overdue and necessary.
Greg, one thing, memo for the next president.
I'm not sure I could say it so eloquently. I would say this, that Mr. President, congratulations.
Or Mrs. President.
Or Mrs. President. Yeah.
Madam President.
Very well said. Congratulations on being elected to lead this remarkable nation at this remarkable moment. And let's remember that one of the most important foundations for government, this government that you're going to lead, is the safety and security of this nation. And in doing that, let's make sure that we're not one-dimensionally defining safety and public safety as just simply locking and warehousing people up. Let's remember that based on this pesky little thing we call a Constitution, that is supposed to be driving our government, that the reality is that 96% of the people that go to prison are going to return back to our neighborhoods. And they're either going to return back better or they're going to return back worse. And you have the moment and opportunity that we find ourselves in our nation to make some serious changes. So good luck, sir.
Professor, one policy prescription for the next president.
What I would urge the next president is to take very seriously the notion of the structural racism in the system, everything from who gets stopped by the police, whose car gets searched, who gets strip searched, who's thrown in a cell, and on to the violent endings of many of these confrontations, to take that seriously, not just as a matter of, oh, let's condemn this officer over here, but to recognize the deeper structural forces that are at work and that we need serious political leadership in order to attack.
Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Have an extraordinary day dealing with this important issue. Thank you.
Deep down, I'm a mess because it's like I'm 21 and in the inside I feel like I'm 40. I always believed in standing up for what I felt was right. And if I would have just been played guilty, then my story would have never been heard. Nobody would have took the time to listen to me. I'd have been just another criminal.
Good morning, everyone. Sitting here with me is Mrs. Vanita Browder, to my left, and also her civil rights lawyer, Paul Prestia. Thank you so much for both being here. You've all seen the video. No doubt you're familiar with Kalief's case. And Kalief's case has become such an egregious example of juvenile injustice, and it's been stirring our collective consciousness and our conscience. But before Kalief was a powerful rallying cry, he was a well-adjusted, happy young man. Can you tell us a little bit about what he was like before jail, Vanita?
Yes, Kalief was just a normal kid, you know. He has 5 other brothers and a sister, and playing pranks, you know, video games, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball, just normal stuff.
And yet he spent 3 years on Rikers Island with no trial, 2 years in solitary confinement. I'm just gonna let that sink in for a second, without a trial.
Yes.
These are devastating numbers, and the conditions under which he was held were even worse. Throughout the time, he was given opportunities to plead guilty and get time served and get out, but he refused. What was it about his personality that made him refuse to plead guilty?
He didn't do it, and he stood his ground, and he wanted a trial to prove his innocence. He was a determined person, and if he felt he was right, he was going to fight for it.
And he certainly did for 3 years. Paul, tell us some of the, I mean, again, these are stark numbers. 3 years at Rikers, and yet the conditions under which he was held were barbaric.
That's an understatement, especially for what you would consider the city of New York, a progressive city like ours. And it's been well documented, the pattern and practice of abuses that have gone on in solitary confinement at Rikers Island. If Kalief was here to articulate what he had gone through by himself, Juju, I'm pretty certain that everyone in the room would be in tears. That's how powerful and how sad his ordeal was.
We're talking about he was on a gang ward. He was not a member of a gang, so he was inflicted beatings. I have some video.
Well, it's even worse than that, Juju. It's the starvation by the guards. It's the treatment by the guards that amounted to torture. I mean, they tortured him. They starved him. They didn't take him outside. They didn't take him to the shower. And I can go on and on and on.
Right.
And I think, right.
Just to bring home the point, we have some video, surveillance video of an incident that actually occurred, one of many, sadly, to Kalief. Sophomore. Vanita, what was those 3 years like for you? You would go to court, he often wouldn't be there, you knew what was going on. What was that like for you as a mom?
It was hard. You know, I mean, when you go there for a court, each court date, I was praying, okay, today's gonna be the day that they say, okay, there's no case, he's gonna go home. But it didn't turn out that way. And sometime I'm sitting in court and he's not there. And normally they'll have him come, you know, appear before lunchtime. So it's lunchtime and no Kalief. So I said, well, what happened? Oh, they didn't bring him. How could you not bring a person for their own court date? And it happened more than twice.
Paul, there were 30 delays in his trial, on his way to trial. This is almost like a waiting game that prosecutors play.
It's certainly a game, but my only conclusion that it was more than a game here, and that it was a reckless disregard by this district attorney's office to prosecute Kalief. And I can only conclude that they presumed him guilty. And this doesn't just happen in Kalief's case. This happens in every borough, in every county in this city, where the prosecutors just assume that this young man's in jail, he's probably guilty, and
they're
he's
waiting
going
for
take
him
a
to plead
plea.
guilty
Right.
because they want their statistics to be positive in terms of...
Right. And the incredible thing about this case is that this wasn't a complex case. It was a very simple case, something that any first-year prosecutor could have at least brought to court and tried before a judge or jury.
And let's talk about a lack of services. When he was let go, he was given a Metro card in the middle of the night, no mental health services. What was that like for him, Vanita?
He came home, but it was Kalief, but it wasn't Kalief. He just was a different person. He was more sad, like in a dark place. He wasn't the same. The smiles disappeared. Once in a while, you'll see a little fragment of a smile.
He had classic PTSD. I mean, you described incidents where he would pace his room.
He would pace the room, the driveway. He used to walk the 4 corners every day. And I said, Kalief, what's the matter? He said, Ma, that's all I was allowed to do, was walk the 4 corners of the room. And it took months, I mean months, for him to stop that.
So for 2 years, sorry, go ahead.
No, what I was just going to mention was that he was released with a Metro card, and they knew at Rikers Island he had a history of suicide attempts.
At Rikers.
Right. So the fact that they sent him home without any sort of medical or follow-up care is beyond belief. So and in Rikers Island, when he was sent, when he did get care for those suicide attempts, on the occasions that the officers actually brought him there, sometimes they sent him back into solitary.
So he had vicious beatings at the hands of gangs. He had solitary confinement for all this time. He clearly had flashbacks every day, Vanita, that you described, and yet he still fought through to get his GED and to keep trying to better himself.
He was determined. He hated Rikers, and he didn't want to do anything to ever go back. He wanted to turn his life, you know, and just be, as you say, a productive citizen or whatever. And he tried. I mean, he got his GED. He took it the first time and passed. Then he enrolled into BCC, Bronx Community College. I mean, he ended his spring semester with a 3.5. Now, you took away 3 years of my son's life. Imagine what he could have accomplished if he was able to be out here getting an education like he was supposed to. He could have went far.
And yet, the depression stayed. Tell me, Paul, you have 2 lawsuits going. One is obviously the wrongful arrest, wrongful imprisonment, but there's also a wrongful death suit. Tell us about those.
Right. Shortly after Kalief's death, we filed a notice of claim with the city of New York. His parents filed it. We filed it on his parents' behalf, alleging, and I actually got the idea from Venita. And we had a conversation, I think, I don't know if it was the day that Kalief passed away, and I was at the house, or it was at the funeral, and she said, you know, it wasn't just one person that killed Kalief. It was a whole system. And this suit is sort of different than your usual wrongful death suit, where, for example, the Eric Gardner case, where the police officer puts a chokehold on him, and he dies, and he wrongfully causes death. What we're alleging here is that 3-year experience, that 3-year ordeal, especially those 2 years of solitary confinement as a teenager, that torture, and incidents like this that you just saw, that corrections officer, Vaughn Greenwich, who I should just mention, is still employed by the corrections department, as far as I know, has not been disciplined, and has not been arrested. That was a crime he committed. But if Commissioner Ponte's here, perhaps he can elaborate on that. In any event, I'm sorry to digress.
Venita,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And with the wrongful death, we're not only alleging that it was the city of New York and its agencies that caused his death and that time in solitary, but even afterward, because he didn't get that proper psychiatric care in solitary, they released him, and he had 3 more setbacks where he had attempted suicide and was hospitalized in psychiatric wards. And even despite that, he was released from those institutions with sporadic, minimal psychiatric care. So we could only conclude that had Kalief not been arrested, he'd be alive today. And I'm sure you're going to touch on this. President Obama abolished solitary for juveniles. He made that executive order earlier in the week. And I think what he said was, it's remarkable that he mentioned Kalief's name, of course, but he even suggested that this solitary, that time in solitary confinement, could lead to suicide.
Absolutely. Tell me, Venita, he had ups, he had downs, he was struggling. Tell us about, what led up to that horrible day.
He would go into these dark places. And when I say dark places, I mean he could be happy, like watching TV. Then all of a sudden you see him and he's like this totally different person. And you have to look and say, oh my God, what happened? But you leave him alone, because if you keep after him, then he shuts down. He became a very private person. And you can't agitate him, because he won't let you in anymore.
And the happy-go-lucky was gone.
And it was gone. And if he would be like that, then next thing you know, he would be happy again. But it was too many memories of what he went through. And no matter how I tried, I just couldn't get through. I'm sorry.
You never really knew. You never really knew.
You can't blame yourself. And I know you were the one who actually found him.
Yes, I was home alone with him, and we had a little discussion earlier, and I was at a loss as to what to do. I didn't know what to do, how to really, help him, because he became very paranoid.
Worried about getting beaten or attacked.
Yes, and I tried talking to him, so he went upstairs, and I was just laying on my bed, and he came in. He said, Ma, that was his thing. Ma, you all right? I said, yeah, I'm okay. He went back upstairs, and I hear all this moving, so I figured, he was in his brother's room. He's situating the room so he could get comfortable and watch TV. Then I hear him pacing from one room to the other, but when Kalief is upset, he paces. So I didn't pay attention. Then all of a sudden, I hear this loud noise, and I'm like, oh my goodness, a child and threw his brother's TV out the window. But I said, he can't, because there's bars. So I said, wait a minute. I go upstairs. I went in his brother's room, nothing. Then I went in the other room, and he had kicked out the air conditioner covers, and I saw this gold rope thing, and I ran downstairs, and when I opened the backyard door, one of his feet was on the bar of the gate, and I said, Kalief, stop playing. This is not a joke. It's not funny. I said, Kalief. And then I got afraid to open the door all the way in case it was my fault that he snapped. But when I looked up, his head was just hanging back. He was gone. And that loud noise was his body banging up against the house.
He had been fighting for 5 years to proclaim his innocence. I can't tell you how sorry we all are for your loss, Vanita. I know we had mentioned it. Mayor de Blasio has spoken up and invoked Kalief's name. President Obama wrote about it in the Washington Post in banning solitary confinement for juveniles. Even Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy has talked about Kalief's case. And yet, to this day, you feel you've not heard an apology.
You know, when I heard Obama, that he mentioned Kalief, I was like, oh goodness, finally. But the President of the United States acknowledged it. Mayor de Blasio and the judge, but the city won't acknowledge it. Rikers, NYPD, the judicial system, all three of them had a part in my son's death, and nobody has come forward to take the blame.
And Juju, the dichotomy there is that the city of New York has made all these reforms in light of Kalief's death. He was the impetus of those reforms. And even Mayor de Blasio, who who started some of these reforms himself, in light of Kalief's death, came out when Kalief passed away and he gave his condolences, which was very nice of him. And then he conveniently changed his subject to mental health, saying we needed more mental health workers. When that wasn't the issue, he should have stood up and been a leader and reprimanded the officers and agencies and individuals involved. And still to this day, no one has come forward and apologized and acknowledged that this happened.
Vanita, it hurts my heart to tell you that we're out of time, but I just want you to get one last answer in, which is, what is justice for you and for Kalief?
For me, justice for me and Kalief is letting them admit that they're the reason my son is dead. If he would have never been literally snatched off the street on a flimsy case that never happened, he would be here now. So I want them to admit it.
But Juju, anything at this point is bittersweet because he's not here.
To say the very least. Paul, thank you so much. Vanita, thank you for coming and sharing.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
The people in here, they're urinating on the floor, and we have to sleep on top of it. They're defecating on the floor, and you have to sleep on top of it.
And we're back with a conversation about jail, not prison per se, it's the warehousing scandal as it is up on the screen. There are over 3,000 jails in the US in nearly every town and every city in the country. And over the course of a year, there will be more than 19 times as many admissions to jail as there are to prisons. So that's what this conversation is focusing on. If jail is meant to hold people who are considered flight risks or dangerous to society before trial, the reality is that jails are actually being used for something entirely different. With me are Stephanie Purcell, right here to my left, clinical psychologist, PhD student and former Rikers medical intern, Judge Stephen Leifman from the 11th Judicial Circuit of Florida, serving Miami-Dade County, Mark Maurer, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, and Karen Martin, all the way at the end there, as Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at John Jay. Stephanie, let me start with you. You were at Rikers. Obviously, we were talking about the horrible, deplorable conditions at Rikers earlier. Tell us about the population there and what's it like in jail for them?
Well, I think in general, jail is incredibly stressful. I mean, just for the average person. I mean, if you can imagine quickly of them locking the doors of this room and knowing that you couldn't leave, you didn't know when you were going to be able to leave, you know, what was happening to your family and your freedom been taken away. And you just couple that with the people who are severely mentally ill, who are fighting hallucinations and delusions, or maybe manic, and who are trying to, you know, cope with all that. It's an incredibly stressful time.
In many ways, we're talking about criminalizing mental illness in a way.
Right.
There's a horrible event that occurred that also was captured on surveillance camera on April 16th. It happened to you in 2014. Let's take a look. A broken jaw, all sorts of long-term injuries, nerve damage, and yet you don't blame the man who punched you.
No. I really truly believe that he didn't act out of malice at all. I think it was really just a symptom of his mental illness. And there was a multitude of factors that was happening that led to that day.
He had been off his meds.
I was told afterwards he was not taking his medication. He was on a different unit, and actually a completely different facility on Rikers Island, and he had been recently moved to a brand new mental health observation unit where he was to get like a higher level of care because he was, an MO unit is a place where they place people who have serious mental illness but who are exhibiting symptoms that they can't be in the general population.
And his case study had not been communicated to you. If you don't blame the inmate, who do you blame?
Really, I believe that Horizon, who was the private company that was providing the mental health care and the medical care to the people at Rikers Island, you know, I feel that if it was communicated to me that he had assaulted 2 women, that's why he was in jail. If he was not being compliant with his medication, he was showing signs at the other unit that his aggression, and that wasn't communicated to me whatsoever. And the fact that he was moved to a new unit without really following the guidelines of just basic treatment. I mean, he was moved without being able to quickly, without being able to terminate the treatment that he was being provided by the counselor's other unit. He was placed in a brand new unit that was understaffed. They opened a new unit with 40 severely mentally ill persons and put 1 clinician, full-time clinician, and a student, myself.
And that was you.
Yeah.
Judge Liefeld, let's talk about sort of this idea of criminalizing mental illness. You are a judge in Miami-Dade. Tell us about the forbidden floor and some of the conditions that you see.
Sure. Fortunately, it changed last year. We closed it. But up until a year ago, we had 4 to 5 inmates in a cell for 1. They took turns sleeping. There was no mattress on the bed. They slept on a cold, peeled, painted metal slab. They did not have clothes. They were given something called a Ferguson gown so that they couldn't commit suicide. So most of them just were naked. The lights were on 24/7, and they were only allowed out 15 minutes 2 times a week.
It sounds like the type of snake pit condition that was criminalized 100 years ago.
Or Abu Ghraib. I mean, you look at those kind of conditions, and it's remarkable, you know, what we've done in this society.
And yet you are part of a 2-tiered system that helps sort of identify and treat people who are suffering from mental illness in the jail system.
You know, it's very easy to try to point blame at individual factors, but we're all at blame. This is a huge societal problem. We have over 2 million people a year with serious mental illnesses arrested. We have about 360,000 people on any given day in the United States with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 760,000 on community control. And it begins with stigma, it begins with ignorance, it begins with closing all the hospitals and not putting something in to replace it. So I think we're all to blame. But the key is then to figure out how to fix it. And about 80% of the solution rests in the community. And one of the nice things about being a judge is people will come to my meetings even if they don't want to be there. and we have this wonderful moral authority to bring people together to fix these kinds of issues. So 15 years ago, we summoned all the different policymakers that could make structural changes in the community to a 2-day event. and we literally mapped out how our criminal justice system intersected with our mental health system. And what we found is that it didn't, that we, the so-called intelligent policy types, were responsible for the problems that we had created, and we were embarrassingly dysfunctional. So we set up a two-part system, a pre- and post-arrest diversion program. And listening to Khalil's mom and that story is so heartbreaking because, God forbid he had been arrested in Miami, he would have been out immediately. He would have been in a program. He would have had a peer counselor. He would have had housing, employment, and within a year the charge would have been dropped.
You were talking backstage about the peer counseling and how important it is to provide hope for prisoners, but also the training for police. You tell us about the reduction in recidivism rate.
Sure.
I mean, it's remarkable.
We have over 4,600 police officers. We have 36 agencies in Miami-Dade. They're all trained, and it includes 4,600 plus officers. They go through a 40-hour program called Crisis Intervention Team Policing, where they're trained on how to identify someone with a serious mental illness, how to de-escalate, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. Between 2010 and 2015, just two of the 36 agencies, the two largest ones, handled 48,669 mental health calls and only made 109 arrests.
That's remarkable.
And what happened is our jail audit plummeted. It went from well over 7,000 to less than 4,400 today.
You were actually able to close one of the jails.
And we closed one of our local,
like
in one of the worst economic periods
Yeah.
the country's seen. And it's because we became intelligent on how to deal with the problem.
Mark, I want you to shift the conversation a little bit. We're talking about warehousing. Obviously, mental health and mentally ill people are warehoused in jails, but so too are a disproportionate percentage of poor people. Why is it that we have this sort of disproportionate impact on low-income communities and low-income people?
Well, it starts with the fact that where police are patrolling, who's brought into jail in the first place. So-called quality of life offenses, things like that, can end a person up in jail, a low-income person, in ways that would never happen to middle-class person. It's exacerbated by the money bail system. We have a broad range of ways in which pretrial release takes place across the country. In far too many jurisdictions, money bail is still the primary means of doing so. What money bail ends up doing is basically says, if we have a white-collar defendant in a very serious crime charge, and we set $1 million bail, he may be able to post that $1 million bail. We've got a low-income defendant who has a $500 bail that he can't post. Now, what does that have to do with his likelihood of appearing in court, future risk, anything like that? So there's no place in the system where we have more of a two-tiered system of justice than at the pretrial stage.
Karen, talk a little bit about the fines and fees. I mean, we know that in theory, debtors' prisons are illegal, and yet?
And they have been since 1833, and yet they are rampant across the country. People are taken off the street for not crimes, things that are perhaps quality of life, but being on the sidewalk with a bicycle or drinking on your stoop or being in a park after dark, and are put in jail. And for something that might be a small cost for a lot of people is a debilitating cost to people who end up in that situation. So having to pay a $50 fine or a $200 fine, they can't get out of jail. The Ferguson report went into this. It's a horrible cycle. People are told one amount and then they're released, but that means they're just sent to the neighboring county, neighboring jurisdiction, and they owe another ticket there. So people are getting caught up in this cycle and they can't get out, and it's only because they can't pay.
And tell me a little bit about the details of the pay for stay scenario that you're talking about.
Well, that's also something that's been outlawed by the Supreme Court ruling, but there are many jurisdictions where people are told almost point blank, and in some places directly, you either pay this fine now or you're going to jail. And I think it's also important to note that some people actually would rather just serve the time, because the threat of the debt and the threat of constantly being under kind of police surveillance and knowing there's a warrant out there for you for not paying is also very difficult to deal with. So I am doing interviews with people, and one person said, he was on parole, and the parole officer said, you have to pay $10 every time I meet with you. And the guy said, you may as well arrest me right now, because I'm not going to have $10, right? And he was, seriously saying, I'd rather just serve the time and then have the government not have any reason to chase me versus having this continual debt. So the debt itself is kind of becoming a punishment.
And the debt is also, you have to pay for your sheets, and you have to pay for your food, and you have to pay for
Yes,
Really?
you have to pay for everything. There's a person I talked to who said, I'm still paying for sheets that I laid on 5 years ago. So literally
In jail.
the sheets that he used in jail, 5 years later, he's still being charged for that, the sheet cost.
Mark, you say that it's more difficult to reform jails than prisons. Why?
Well, in part, it's because we have so many, they're so dispersed. You know, we have 3,000 jails around the country. At least when it comes to prison, we've got 50 state commissioners of corrections. You know, you can, as a legislature, have oversight. You can set policies if you want. The jails are largely run as their own little fiefdoms. And so we go from extremes of Rikers, you know, as horrible as it is, at least everybody knows what's going on there. And then you get jails in small rural counties where judges, prosecutors are just running a show there, very little paying attention to any kind of due process issues, certainly not up to date on how we deal with money bail issues and the like. So the oversight ability of lawyers to litigate unconstitutional conditions becomes extremely difficult to do.
And I gather that your view is that even short stays in jail can have truly negative outcomes.
Yeah, you know, there are many people say, well, most of the people are in and out of jail within 48 hours, so what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal. You know, if you've got a job, particularly if it's a low-wage job, and you don't show up for 2 days and you can't call to say why you're not there, there's a good chance you're going to lose your job. People come into jail, as we've heard, with all sorts of health issues, mental health, physical health. In 48 hours, it's very unlikely they're going to get the medication they need or the mental health they need in most jail situations. So you're going to have all those stresses.
Just last one. I know a lot of people think whenever you hear about programs, do-good programs, everyone assumes it costs a lot of money and that it can't be replicated, that you have some special slush fund, I'm sure, that you're drawing from. Tell us about it.
We've done a very good job of accessing existing services. There's a lot of duplication and fragmentation in all of our systems, and that's the key of bringing everybody together. The court has no money. And so what we have to rely on is actually accessing programs that already exist. And we've been very successful at doing that. I'm also part of a national campaign called Stepping Up right now, where we're working with the counties, Council of State Government, and the American Psychiatric Association Foundation to replicate this model nationally.
I understand that you are able to identify repeat cycle folks, that there were 97 people that you identified. Tell me about it. It's such an interesting cost-effective.
Miami-Dade actually has the highest percentage of people with mental illnesses of any urban area in the United States. It's actually over 9% of our general population, which is almost 3 times the national average. So when we started the project, we thought, well, if we could at least identify a couple thousand of the highest utilizers of both criminal justice and mental health services, we could do a better job of getting them the services they need and stop the recidivism. So we commissioned a study through a university, and we asked them to tell us who the highest utilizers in Miami-Dade were of criminal justice and mental health services. So I wait, and I finally get a letter in the mail. I open it up, and there's one piece of paper. And on the piece of paper are the names of 97 people, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with schizophrenia type disorder, primarily co-occurring, and primarily homeless, who over a 5-year period were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail, 13,000 days at an emergency room, crisis unit, or psychiatric facility, and cost taxpayers almost $13 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. And so there's money out there.
Right.
It's just we spend it in all the wrong places.
In the wrong places.
And it's not nefarious. It's, you know, when we had this summit, it's just we're all so busy doing our jobs. The police are policing, the prosecutor prosecuting, the judge is judging, defender defending, and no one's watching out for this one person who's just severely ill.
Right.
And
it's like a pinball running through a
yeah, but
pinball machine
what's
being
worse,
hit by all the bumpers, and
what's
no one's...
worse is then we punish them for not behaving the way we expect, and we don't give them the services they need to behave in the way they can.
Right.
And that's
Stephanie,
what's so
talking
galling.
about those services, you, despite what happened to you, still work in the mental health field. What reforms would you like to see?
You know, looking back at what we were saying here, that when you're mentally ill and have very little money, you don't have advocacy. You know, a lot of these people come to jail and they don't have families to reach out to, and they don't have any money. I mean, I've been at Rikers and have people with bails set at $1, and they don't have $1, so they sit at Rikers for months at a time. If they had, but they don't have anybody to reach out to. They're
for the lack of that money.
For lack of that money.
Right.
And I really think if they had an advocate, somebody that could go with them to court, explain to them what's going on if they have $1 bail. I mean, maybe we could have some kind of fund to help them get out. And we see stories on the outside. I mean, whether, inside jail, it's just increasing their mental illness.
Mark, let's take a look a little bit at money. Everyone says follow the money. Take a look at the money at the system for me. Most people in jail haven't even been convicted of a crime. So in addition to warehousing the mentally ill, there are people like Kalief who are being locked up simply because they can't afford that bail.
They can't afford the bail, or we've got a probation violation, or a million other things. Now, sometimes there are public safety issues that come up. We need to address those in a clear way, but there's generally very little systematic overview. So we set a bail on a person who's just been arrested. Is there a bail review to see if that's a reasonable amount and the person can get out? Are there conditions under which we could let that person out and supervise them without relying on money? So we need to look at those kinds of things. We're not, as the judge said, we rarely take a systemic view of how we're approaching these issues. How much of our resources go into jail? If we could cut down jail stays from 6 days to 2 days, that could have a significant impact. Then you've got resources you can put into other things. And certainly, we're using jails because we're not being very creative. Many of these kinds of things don't need to be in the justice system in the first place, or certainly don't require a jail stay.
Karen, how are those distinctions drawn? I mean, let's just look at unpaid fines, for example, the difference between willfully not paying, right, or being truly indigent. How is that determined?
Well, it's completely up to the judge. So that is the Bratton v. Georgia is the Supreme Court case, and so that said that you can only be essentially punished for not paying if it's willful non-payment. The problem is that is entirely up to judges. So if you walk in and you have a manicure, you have nice shoes, or you have a cell phone, a judge can say, "Oh, see, you're willfully not paying because you can afford that manicure. So that means that you are violating the terms of your probation or parole. So I'm going to lock you up." And so the distinction gets very fuzzy in there. And as you were saying, there are completely fiefdoms. I would say it goes further and say that law enforcement now has this incentive to pursue things that will bring in money to certain jurisdictions. And in Ferguson, again,
I was going to say that harkens back to the DOJ report, because it really talked about drawing the lines and seeing collusion between the government branches to generate revenue off of people, primarily poor people in Ferguson.
Very explicitly. So the city manager talking to the judge, talking to the
Tell them about the emails in that report.
Well, it said, I talked to the police chief. I told him that we have this bottom line. We need to increase revenue by X amount. He said he could do it. I mean, it doesn't really get any clearer than that.
Pretty blank. Yeah, pretty blank.
And they're targeting, in that situation, they were targeting primarily African Americans, primarily people who don't have a lot of money. And again, it was just putting people into this system. There's one, and I would just add to this issue of people not being able to afford bail. We are also in a situation where most states now charge for indigent defense. So indigent means you have no money, and so we're charging people who have no money for representation. And it can be $5, but it can also be $400, right? And that flies to the face of
It goes to a further level, though. The tax structure in the country has changed so much that we go to a fee base. So if you get a speeding ticket in Florida and 2 other tickets, it can be $3,000. And so then you have to go to work and you keep driving, and then you get pulled over. Now it's a criminal offense of driving on a suspended license. So you come in, and then you have the court cost on top of it. And in Florida, if you don't pay your court costs, they suspend your license again. And people get into a hole that they never get out, and they just end up in jail because the policies are so skewed against them.
We only have a minute left. I want you each to give us your final thoughts. Where do we draw the political will? Look towards the future for me. What should we all be thinking about, Stephanie?
I think really just an attitude, thinking of mental illness in general, just our attitude that people need help, regardless of where they are, and to be able to have people believe that money is needed in that area. I mean, people think about, if you ever read the comment sections, but if they're in jail, for some reason they need to be punished. And regardless of whether they're ill or not, there's an attitude in the general public that these people don't need treatment. And I think if we could work on changing that attitude, that we can get money to these systems and hopefully not house severely mentally ill people in the jail. We can have separate facilities like they do in Miami.
Judge Lefman.
Look, people with mental illnesses are just people who happen to have an illness. They have the same needs and desires and dreams of everybody else. And they unfortunately have been so marginalized and abused in our society, it's hard for them to even want to get help at this point. And so we have to make systemic changes in the community that offer them a way out and an opportunity for hope. And when you do that, it is absolutely remarkable the results that you can have.
We've gone from deinstitutionalizing them and then putting them in a different institution.
There's no doubt about it.
Basically. Mark.
You know, I work on policy change every day, but I think one of the things we really need to do is tell stories. You know, the courage of Kalief's mom to be able to tell that story. I think there are far too many people in this country who just refuse to believe or won't accept the reality of what's happening in the justice system every day. We need to bring that home, and not everybody's going to read the policy reports or go to the legislative hearings. So we need to make that come alive, and sometimes it takes a tragedy, but at least we can get something out of it, I think.
Mark, thank you.
And I would just add that the best way to denigrate your own dignity is to denigrate somebody else's, and that's essentially what we're doing in the criminal justice system right now. And I think we need to understand that everybody is a human being, everybody has human dignity, and go with that.
Powerful thoughts. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you.
Your cronies are going to see that they better not trade on inside information or abuse their positions, or they're going to end up like you. Broke, humiliated, and incarcerated. As per the law.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Kleidman, and I am really pleased to have the opportunity to interview Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, sometimes known as the Sheriff of Albany and the Watchdog of Wall Street. And I gather the inspiration for this new Showtime drama that just started, a couple of weeks ago?
I think that's right.
So I got to start there. Preet, what's it like to be portrayed on television by Paul Giamatti?
I mean, I guess it's pretty cool. It's a highly fictionalized account. For those of you who have seen it, some of those things don't actually happen.
Well, there is the line about the 82 straight insider trader convictions, which is more or less true.
Right, it was true.
The dominatrix scene, not so much.
Correct. You're good, you're good.
But look, there actually is an interesting point here. I mean, there's a reason that your job gets the Hollywood treatment. And it's one of the few high-profile legal jobs that really captures the public's imagination. And you saw some of the words, you didn't see them, but the headlines that were up there, words associated with this job: brash, dangerous, white knight, headline grabbing. What is it about this job that makes it such an object of public fascination? And what is it about your upbringing, your personality, your values that made you really want this job?
Well, I think there's always been a fascination with justice. I mean, we're here for the Justice Summit. I think people care about how justice is meted out. I think they care about how people are treated in the system. They care about the stakes that are in play when crimes are committed and when people's liberty is at issue. And that's always been true. That's been true in Hollywood from the beginning. It's been true in human nature. And I think when you have the stakes that you have at play in a prosecutor's office and with defense and in a courtroom, that's compelling stuff. And our office, is fortunate to have on its docket some of the most interesting and cutting-edge cases that you have anywhere in the country. That was true long before I got there. It'll be true long after I leave. Whether you're talking about terrorism or cybercrime or Wall Street or corruption, those are some of the issues that people care about, and how they play out and who gets held accountable is, I think, compelling and interesting to people. Why I wanted to do it, I don't know that I ever aspired to have the job of the boss in the office, but from a fairly young time when I was in law school and even before, when I decided I wanted to be some kind of trial lawyer, I thought the best way to serve would be to wake up every morning and do what the job requires in our office and in the Justice Department, and that is you aspire to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons all the time. It doesn't always work out, and that's why you have summits like this, so we can re-examine the ways in which we go about doing that job. But I think there's no more exhilarating way to spend your time than to wake up every morning and only do the cases you think are good and righteous to do.
You have a reputation as a pretty aggressive and tough prosecutor, but I'm curious, before you took the job, did you anticipate the sort of depth of criminality and the kind of impunity of behavior that you found, and particularly among the sort of well-heeled, well-educated, people on Wall Street and in Albany, let's say?
I don't think you find it surprising. I had been a line prosecutor for 5 years in the office before, doing mostly mob cases, Russian organized crime and Italian organized crime. And you realize, if you pay attention in the world, that sometimes with a lot of power comes a lot of arrogance and comes a feeling that you can get away with it. And going back to your first question, one of the great things about our office is the level of independence it has and fearlessness that it has on the part of the career people who have been there for a long time. Is we don't care who you are, we don't care how big you are, we don't care how powerful you are, we don't care how much money you have, you're not above the law.
Well, I want to say on this a little bit, this sort of what you've learned about the human condition, because I know that you've had this running debate for years with your old friend, college friend, Viet Din, another esteemed lawyer. I covered him when he was in the Bush Justice Department. The debate over whether man is fundamentally good or fundamentally evil. And I think you took the sort of sunnier position over the years.
I was young. I was very young.
All right. So that's what I wanted to ask you about. So you've been doing this for, 7 years now? You're seeing the dark underside of a lot of things that are happening in this city. How has your view evolved on that fundamental question? Is it more complex than it was in those earlier years when you were debating Viet?
I think so. I mean, we see a lot of very terrible things every day. It's the nature of the job. It's the definition of the job. Terrorists who want to bring down our country, people who kill children, people who kill witnesses, people who steal from old people who don't have money. So there's a lot of evil, there's a lot of bad stuff. But I still think that I like to think that people are fundamentally good, that the things that inspire people are what's good in the world. And I often say about my office, in the face of all that bad stuff that the prosecutors and the agents have to deal with all the time, I mean, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of pain, a lot of death, a lot of destruction, that the nice thing to see in the midst of all that is how much they hold on to their idealism, and they think, well, if I do my job well, maybe we can do something about that. Maybe we can make the world a little bit better and the community a little bit safer, and that's a wonderful thing to see. I still do think, even if it may not be ultimately true, it is a better thing to believe that people are more good than they are evil.
Well, let's stick with the evil for a little bit.
Okay.
You generated a lot of your biggest headlines during corruption cases. And I'm curious, what makes a person corrupt? What's the essential ingredient, the sort of Achilles heel? What have you learned about that aspect of the human condition?
Yeah, so it's impossible to, I mean, people ask that question about Wall Street, they ask it about public corruption. You don't know. I mean, corruption comes in different stripes. So some people are just venal and they're born that way and they go into office thinking they want to rip off the people who elected them. Some people, after a period of time, feel like it's owed to them because they're not making the kind of money they thought they were going to make. So it's all different reasons. What I do think is true is that institutions have to be established in a way and have to be governed in a way and have to have a certain kind of culture that brings out the best in people and doesn't allow, as much as some places do, people to get away with bad things. I mean, cultures matter. There's more corruption in certain firms on Wall Street than others. There's more corruption in certain state capitals than in others. And what's the difference? It's the same job. And I think a lot of that has to do with culture, a culture in which you police yourself, a culture in which people who think that bad things are going on come forward and say something instead of being afraid and watch it happen in silence. That's true whether you're talking about a hedge fund, it's true whether you're talking about a legislature, it's true whether you're talking about a university like Penn State. Good people have to come forward. And so when I talk to audiences about the issue of how you make places better, I often say, I'm directing my words to the ears not of the 2 or 3 people in the room who are statistically speaking likely to commit serious crimes in the future, although I know who you are.
And you've got subpoenas with you.
Yeah, I got guys outside. It's more to direct my words to the ears of the vast majority of people in any room you enter who are good and honest and honorable and have integrity, who you hope will do something when they see bad things happen. I mean, all these cases, that some of which were cited to, whether it's the Madoff case or the Galleon case, lots of bad things could have been solved and stanched, and a lot of pain could have been prevented and avoided if the good, forget about the bad people, the evil people, but if the good people had done something about it. By the time the FBI agents show up and the prosecutors show up, the place is already on the verge of burning down. And so the lesson for me when we're talking about justice generally, whether you're talking about Rikers Island or some of the other issues that I heard about from the earlier panel, you have to have the good people at the place do something about it and have the courage to come forward.
Well, I want to get to that issue of how you change the culture and what role you could play in that. But before that, you called Albany a cauldron of corruption.
I said that?
You did. So can you talk in concrete terms, as vividly as you can, about how this kind of behavior impacts the lives of ordinary people? Why should people care? And to what extent does it corrode our democracy?
People should. I spend a lot of time talking about why, excuse me, why people should care. Legislators actually matter, and some of them are not known, and their faces are not familiar to everyone. But state legislatures, whether it's in New York or it's in Kentucky, where I spoke recently, they decide often what kind of taxes you pay. They decide how your children are educated. They decide what is a crime, what is not. They decide things like what bail reform should look like or not look like. A lot of the issues that you care about in this room are decided by these people who are elected to serve in Albany and in other state legislatures around the country. And so it's a very pragmatic, practical matter. If you have people there who are on the take, and if you have people there who are in a system that is rigged, then you're not getting the benefit of your vote, and you're not getting the best results that you could possibly get. And we have a case, we have charged, I think, a dozen state legislators, and there was a time, it might still be true, when you're more likely to be indicted as a state senator in New York than be turned away, than be defeated at the polls. Now that's a culture problem that has real effects on everyday people, separate and apart from the policies that they put in place, which may be done for corrupt reasons and may be done for the special interests and the people who have money or whatever the other causes might be. Separate and apart from that, I think it otherwise undermines people's faith in democracy. It makes people turn away in disgust. It makes people not want to go into public service. It makes people think they can't do anything about the system. And I think you get a cycle of corrosiveness that happens, as has happened in Albany for a period of time, and that's not a good thing for anybody. A little earlier in the green room, you were talking about how in some of these big cases, you actually have had a pretty hands-on role. Obviously, you're going to the court, you're going to the trial, but you're also examining the evidence ahead of time. Take us behind the scenes. As you listen to the evidence in, say, one of these big corruption cases, was there a kind of let's say you're listening to wiretaps, is there an aha moment when you realize, we're not just talking about some bad apples here, we're talking about a fundamental, deeply rooted culture of corruption. And was there anything that sort of sickened you the most as you were kind of listening to the evidence? It takes a lot to sicken me. I have a very strong stomach. I don't know if there was an aha moment. Cases of that significance and complexity are built up by the amazing prosecutors in my office. I didn't build those cases up. They briefed me on things on a regular basis. But there were moments when you thought, well, I think we're on the right track here. For example, we were on court-authorized wiretaps with respect to the Senate Majority Leader's son, who was convicted, and the Senate Majority Leader and his son, who were both convicted at trial last month. And there was a moment when, and the wiretap call was sent to me, and it was played in open court, so I'm not saying anything that's secret, where the son was talking to the father, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and complaining about the heat that had been reportedly brought to bear on the part of the feds, which I guess was us. And he says on the wiretap call, it's really frustrating, Dad. It's getting really hard to talk to you. It's like effing Preet Bharara is listening to every effing phone call. So that was a moment that was interesting, including that one. Yeah.
Well, let's talk quickly about how you change the culture, because ultimately you can't do it solely through prosecutions, right?
I don't think you can solve. One thing that I presume you're going to be talking about all day today is you can't solve anything that's fundamentally important through prosecution. You know, I think the people in my office have an important job, but it's a blunt instrument, prosecution. You can't solve the problems in prisons. You can't solve the problem of corruption. You can't solve the problem of drugs. You can't solve the problem of corruption on Wall Street by prosecutions. That's one part of the puzzle. You want to hold people accountable, and you want people to understand that there's a cop on the beat, and so if you cross the line into illegality, you could go to prison, and hopefully that deters people. But with respect to corruption, for example, there's a role for the politicians themselves. I mean, any institution is best fixed and is most likely to have a good culture if it polices itself. That's true, again, of a school, it's true of a hedge fund, it's true of a legislature. And there's been precious little self-policing going on in Albany by every account. So separate and apart from them, there's a role for the press to play and to do a better job of investigative journalism. And we read the papers, and some of the cases we bring, we bring because we've read about something that an enterprising reporter has brought to light, and then we investigate it also. And then finally, it's really up to the people, I think, and that's true for a lot of things. I mean, it's the people who put those people in office, and I think they have to demand more of those folks. And when there are scandals or there's evidence of people not, following their oath, people have to get mad and angry and upset about that for all the reasons I mentioned before, because they have a real effect on people's lives and livelihoods in ways that affect them.
So a question you get asked a lot is why none of the big fish went to prison after their role in the financial collapse. Because for the average man on the street, they can't fathom it. I mean, the amount of destruction and harm that was done to people's lives, how could there not be that kind of accountability? That the people responsible would really pay for it. Is it because there was no criminal behavior? Is it because there was criminal behavior, but you all couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? And does that suggest there's something wrong with the system or something right with the system?
Those are a lot of complicated questions. I think that I do get the question a lot, and it's an important question. It's a question we ask ourselves. And the first thing I think people should understand and know is that there was no one more disgusted and upset and affected by the financial crisis than the flesh and blood career prosecutors and agents in my own office. I mean, before we are prosecutors, we are citizens, and we have families, and we have 401k plans also. So, people worked and work really hard to hold people accountable because that's their job, but also when you're yourself a victim of a bad thing that happened, like everyone was a victim of the financial crisis, that gives you even more incentive to work as hard as you can. As has been said, and I hope people appreciate, I think our office is as aggressive as any in the country. Some people think overly aggressive on financial crime or otherwise. And if there was, we didn't look at everything there was to look at. Various offices looked at different things. But to the extent there was anything to be done as far as arrests of the type you're talking about, if there were cases that we could have brought and proven, we would have done it. We had the will to do it. We had the expertise to do it. We had the effort was made to do it. Now, it's a combination of two things, I think. Sometimes there are complicated things that cause bad things to happen, and there was bad behavior and misconduct and recklessness that doesn't always rise to the level of a crime. And in other cases, but it's hard to know, perhaps there were crimes committed, but you don't have the evidence. There's lots of people who get away with crimes.
All right. Well, let me follow up on that point. Because there were crimes committed, but you couldn't prove them. If you could go back in time, say it's January 2009, and with the benefit of all the experience your office has had and the knowledge that you have over the last 7 years, is there anything you would do differently? I mean, would you bring more resources to bear? Would you use more wiretaps? I mean, what would you do differently if the same kind of activity was taking place?
I don't think there was a failure of resources there or a failure of will. I wasn't there at the I joined the office much later, and again, I'm one office, and decisions were made about who would look at which bad things that arose from the financial crisis. And maybe it's possible that someone, taking a step back, maybe someone should ask that question later in the day if an individual is coming. But I think that the people in my office worked as hard as they could to try to see if there was a crime based on the things that they were looking at. I mean, look, part of the problem was when you look carefully at some of the representations made with respect to securitization, not to get deep in the weeds for too long, you had outside lawyers and accountants who were giving them basically blessings to make certain levels of representation. And it's very hard when you talk about the criminal justice system and what you have to prove and how easy it is for prosecutors to put people in prison. There's a reason that it is as hard as it is when you're talking about the mental state of a person. You have to be able to prove that the person at the head of the bank or the head of an organized crime family actually ordered the thing to be done. It can't be done by innuendo. It can't be done by speculation. And sometimes if you don't have the wiretap, in the case we were talking about before, if we didn't have the wiretaps with respect to the Senate Majority Leader, I'm not sure that we would have been able to make that case. The crime was committed, and we were fortunate enough, and I had really, really wily people in my office who were smart enough to figure out how to get the court-authorized wiretap. But in some things in connection with the financial crisis, I think there's not the evidence to have brought the cases that some people thought should have been brought.
Okay, so time is running out, so we're going to do the lightning round now.
Okay.
I want to ask you very quickly about your public role as U.S. Attorney, because you've got some criticism for being a grandstander. There was a federal judge who said, some of your public comments, you ought to be trying cases in the courtroom, not on the press.
Yeah, we do
quickly,
that. We do that too. I think it is ridiculous that a district attorney or a United States attorney who has learned something about what the root causes of crime might be and how culture might be affected based on the cases that are brought doesn't say something publicly about it. I was invited here for a reason, presumably, and that's to talk about those things. And the prosecutor's job, going back to the overall issue of how you make the world better and how you make the country and the community better, is not just to prosecute, but also to prevent and also to educate. So whether you're talking about the prescription pill and heroin problem that is rampant everywhere in the country and especially here in New York, it is important for public officials to talk about why that's a problem. It's important to talk about how you can improve culture on Wall Street. It's important to talk about how you can improve culture in Albany as well. And I'm going to keep talking about it because it's the right thing to do.
Let's do quickly cybercrime and then terrorism in 35 seconds. Cybercrime.
That's the right amount of time for that.
Why are those cases? Those cases are real challenges for you, aren't they?
They are. So quickly, speed talk. Cybercrime is really hard because not only do you have to prove a crime was committed, that bad guys somewhere infiltrated servers in a computer system and took customer data out, or stole trade secrets or stole intellectual property, you have to prove who did it. And most of the time it's from somewhere outside the country, often it's a nation state, really, really sophisticated people, and you have to connect those things. And that, it doubles or triples the level of difficulty sometimes when you're talking about proving cybercrime.
Terrorism, New York, ISIS is still on the minds of a lot of people. New York, what's the biggest threat right now in this city? And to what extent is New York still the biggest target?
I think New York always remains the biggest target in the world for a lot of reasons, because people want to take us down, and we always have to be vigilant about it. I think the lone wolf issue, the ISIS issue, FBI Director Jim Comey talks about it all the time. It was once upon a time, I think people were a little bit more sanguine about being able to know that people who were doing bad things were trained abroad in Afghanistan or somewhere else, and you might get a tripwire that they would hit, and you would know that people were buying certain kinds of things or training in certain places or having certain kinds of communications. You don't know if you're going to find that out this time around, and so it's a much harder thing to probe.
I want to ask you a question about something that's near and dear to my heart. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, he was supposed to be tried in your courthouse, by your office in New York City in civilian court. New York politicians essentially pressured the Justice Department to change that. It went back into the military system, and it's now been 15 years since Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has been, he has been tried in 15 years. What do you say to the victims, most of whom reside in your jurisdiction, the relatives of the victims, for not getting justice?
Yeah, I say I'm sorry that you haven't gotten justice yet. Another good question for Mr. Holder, who's coming later. It was 6.5 years ago that he called me in November of 2009 and said that your office will be prosecuting Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And then obviously for reasons that you describe and other reasons, that didn't end up happening, and he remains in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. In those 6.5 years, my office and the great career prosecutors in my office with the Joint Terrorism Task Force have convicted terrorist after terrorist after terrorist, including Osama bin Laden's son-in-law and a whole host of other people who were involved in acts of tremendous violence, killing Americans over and over and over again, while I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is awaiting his first pretrial conference or something like that. And it's unfortunate that that's the case, but I hope that part of I know you care about this and you've written a great book about it. I hope that part of the legacy of the last several years after the controversy surrounding the decision about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is that quietly and with the track record of my office and others, that we have been able to prove that the Article III civilian justice system is the best in the world, We should be incredibly, notwithstanding the problems that it has, that we should focus on and try to reform. But it's the best in the world, and it shows everyone that all of these bad things people thought would arise if we tried terrorists in a local court in New York didn't come to pass, and may not have come to pass had we tried Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as well.
Would you be willing to consider serving as Hillary Clinton's Attorney General if she becomes president?
I'll wait till that happens.
Are you running for governor?
I am not.
Okay.
Anything
Preet,
else? All right.
thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
These are the words of Taurus Buchanan, who at 16 years old threw one punch during a neighborhood fight. He was charged with homicide and is serving life without parole in Angola, America's largest maximum security prison. Taurus will be 39 years old today. I remember that morning. I was scheduled to go on a gospel tour with my dad, you know. I was supposed to be taking a bath, ironing my clothes, packing my stuff, getting my stuff ready. But then I heard a commotion outside. That was my cousin. You know, they was outside with some friends. Now I'm really going down there to brag, you know, about the trip. We started shooting a breeze about a party that was coming up Saturday. Jacques and his friend, they were up the street, and I didn't recognize him at first, so I asked my cousin, did he know him? My cousin told me, yeah, that's one of them that jumped on me and threw me in the canal. That was the last day of school they had jumped on him. So I asked him, I was like, what are you gonna do? You gonna take care of your business? He was like, yeah, I'm gonna take care of my business. He started tying up his shoes, tightening up his shoelaces and stuff. That was the culture, you know. Before every fight, people would tie up their shoelaces and tighten up their sneakers and stuff. When they got close, my cousin jumped in. He was like, boom, what you want to do now? Jacques got off his bike and they started fighting. Now, a lot of it is vague right now, but I'm giving you the main parts. The fight moved from where we were to where they came from, and my cousin slipped. Jacques started getting the best of him, and so I ran over there. Now, I'm going to tell you what I did. I pushed him, but it was a hard push, like on the side of his neck. Now, if a person really didn't know or wasn't paying attention, you could swear that I punched him. But I pushed him that hard. Plus, he was a very bony guy. You know, he fell like a wet paper bag, I'm not gonna lie. And I walked off. You know what my charge is? I'm accused of throwing one punch in a fist fight, and a young brother lost his life, which was a tragic situation, which should have never happened because who knows what that young man could have been. His life was cut short, you know. That was an accident, and it should have never happened. When I first got to the police station, they handcuffed me to a bar on the wall, and I was shaking, not because it was cold, but because I was nervous. I had been in trouble before, but at that moment, I realized that I wasn't ready for what I was facing. I had never been in nothing that serious. You know, I'm thinking somebody's dead. And while they was taking pictures of my hands, I was crying, telling the cop, you know, we ain't intend for nobody to die. We didn't want to kill nobody. We was just fighting, you know, what he died from, what happened. The whole time I was in that cold tank. It was dark in there. The light barely shone through the clouded film. I started praying to God. I was asking him to deliver me from my situation, to vindicate me. I was praying whatever prayer I knew. They came and opened up the door, and we went to trial. and I was found guilty 3 days later. Yep. Judge didn't even ask me if I had anything I wanted to say, which if he had, I would have told him the same thing I've been telling everybody for years. I'm sorry it happened. Jacques could never have lost his life, you know? Nobody intended on that happening. You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry it happened. It should have never happened. I had this thought many times over. If I could have blown breath back into his body so he could live again, I would have done that. Even now, I wish I could do that. We was kids, you know what I'm saying? We were young. We didn't realize how much of a child we were until we ended up in some grown situation.
Tony Clayton was a young and eager prosecutor, just 2 years into the job and assigned his first murder case. These are his words. One punch. It wasn't beating him up. It was a one-punch case. I was a young, braggadocious kind of little kid. I said, oh man, I can convict, I can do it, just give me the damn case. I took the file and I worked it up. I went out into the neighborhood and I was able to get a conviction on it. This case has forever haunted me because I've constantly questioned myself. If I had it to do all the way over again, I don't think I would prosecute him for murder. I would offer him 21 years and let him do 7. That's what I would do. The reason being, I would deem it as manslaughter, and that has a provision in it that says, any misdemeanor affecting a kid of a certain age that results in the death of a kid is considered a manslaughter. Here is a simple battery, punching him in the head that resulted in death. I don't think the Louisiana murder statute was designed to lock up 16-year-old kids for throwing one punch. I should have not prosecuted Taurus for murder. I think I went too far. If the state of Louisiana lets him out, I would fall on my knees and thank God. This is a time the system would work if they let that kid out. I love my kids. I don't want anything to happen to my kids. I don't want a Taurus Buchanan to beat one of them up, but I also know that people make mistakes and there are second chances and they should let Taurus go. He's paid his debt to society. For all practical purposes, he's been a model prisoner. He should get out and he should be able to prove himself. I did see him several years ago. I went to a boxing match and I talked to him. I forget the gist of the conversation, but he was cordial to me. He was respectful and said he understood. And I said, man, just let me tell you, I was young then. And I left it at that. I didn't apologize to him. And I'm never going to apologize to him because I didn't do him wrong. I think I did myself wrong because I have to live with what he's going through.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bianca Goldriga from Yahoo News, and those indeed are some depressing facts. But the news is not all bad. In fact, juvenile incarceration has fallen dramatically over the past few years, and as you all know, this has been a huge week for juvenile justice. Just days ago, President Obama banned solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prisons, and the Supreme Court ruled to enforce its ban on mandatory life sentences for juveniles. However, 14 states still have no minimum age to try children as adults. And as we speak, approximately 10,000 children sit in America's adults' prisons. So for many young people, the path to prison begins at school. Or more accurately, it begins with being ejected from school. Suspension or expulsion vastly increases a person's likelihood of ending up in prison later in life. And in America, Black and Latino youth are expelled 3 times as often as white students, and they make up 70% of in-school arrests. The panel beside me here is to talk about how this is happening and how they are working to course and correct the situation. Actor and playwright Anna Deavere Smith, her latest play, Notes from the Field, Doing Time in Education, is a brilliant bird's eye view of our failing education and justice system. In it, she brings issues to life with testimony from judges, teachers, doctors, parents, students, and activists, and of course, many more. To her left is Judge Jimmy Edwards. He's a circuit court judge from St. Louis. He founded the Innovation Concept Academy, a remarkable school for at-risk youth. The school is a lifeline for hundreds of young people who would otherwise be denied an education. And to his right is Adam Foss. He's an assistant district attorney from Suffolk County in Boston. He is trained to become a defense attorney in law school, but quickly decided that he would be more positive of a force as a prosecutor, and we'll get into that decision later on. And last but not least, Joanne Jaffe is the chief of the Community Affairs Bureau for NYPD. Under her purview are the Juvenile Justice and School Safety Divisions for New York City Police Department. So thank you all for joining us in this very interesting topic and what will be an interesting conversation. So even though the juvenile incarceration is falling, we're still seeing the need for more improvement. Adam, I want to start with you and get more context as to how we got here. The spike in juvenile incarceration in the 1980s really is where we are right now and what we're trying to deal with as far as numbers. How did we get here?
As you saw in the video, there was a phenomenon that sort of was generated in the media and circulated throughout the public that in the late 80s, early 90s, and into the new millennium, there would be this thing called the super predator, which were the kids of parents who had been incarcerated, parents who had been disenfranchised, and this whole section of kids was going to terrorize the United States of America. So that, in combination with Columbine school shooting and other such events, there was a confluence of those events that created policies which really started in the schools with zero tolerance, which got us to where we are today.
And Anna, in doing research for your play, Doing Time in Education, you had the opportunity to speak to parents, to students, and the prison as well. Can you describe what the school to prison pipeline is?
Sure. So I've done about 200 interviews now, and I can see people in the audience who I know and know what I do, which is that I interview people and then I make plays where I strive to embody the problem and represent it from multiple points of view. And in doing this project, I've interviewed now about 200 people. And I actually think that I would like to not call it the school to prison pipeline. I think that's unfair to schools, it's unfair to teachers, and sort of the best advice I got when I started was the then dean of the School of Education, Graduate School of Education at Stanford, Claude Steele, who said this is really a problem of poverty. And so in that context, I'll say that I have lots of good news, that I have met a lot of wounded healers, and I would say that the spans of people doing things that I've met range from the chief judge of the Yurok tribe in Northern California who believes that culture, and going back to original cultural forms like dances, can make a difference, to world-famous neuroendocrinologist Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, who's doing work on brain plasticity. A lot of people doing work on trauma, the effect of stress and poverty on development of cognitive development, but we're also meeting people who are using science to figure out how to make early interventions. So there's a lot of good news out there.
And we're going to get to some of that good news in a bit more detail later on in this discussion. But Judge Edwards, you've been a judge in juvenile court for many years. Can you explain what effect suspension does have on a juvenile?
Well, firstly, a humanitarian problem. The thoroughly refuted zero-tolerance laws in America have always made zero sense. Suspensions and expulsions with respect to children will inevitably cause them to be imprisoned. Unfortunately, we oftentimes look at third grade reading levels, second grade reading levels, but it's the suspensions and the expulsions of inmates that appear to be the most glaring problem. In Missouri, we've tried to change that. I know that there's no measurable difference between the students, the African American and brown students, and very poor white students in my community, and myself. So we set out to try to address that problem to keep kids in school. Education is the key. Certainly, it is the key to a good paycheck. We all want that.
Right.
But with education comes the ability for our children to have success. So in my mind, it is indeed the most important thing to do. And so it raises and begs a lot of questions as to how do we keep children in school? Well, we have to do those things that are necessary to address that double problem that children have. Our children are living a double life. They live in an environment and a home life where they get themselves in trouble, no mom, no dad, chaos. And then at school, we expect for them to be good citizens. So how do we address that?
And you've talked to a lot of these children. In fact, 5 of your students have been murdered over the past few years. What is life like for these children? Can you give us some more specific examples and stories that you hear from day on end?
Our children want to succeed, and certainly they have the capacity to do that. But it's very, very difficult. They're at home, they're trying to live in an environment that requires them to be a certain type of person. You have to be a gang member, you have to be tough. Just last final semester, the final exam period, I had a child, William, who was one of those kids, lives in a tough neighborhood. William arrived at school to take his test because that's what Judge Edwards wants. You have to be there. You have to be educated. But William arrived at school with a loaded 9mm. He took it out of his pocket and he gave it to the security officer. And he said, "Would you please keep this gun for me until I finish my test?" William was arrested. You can't bring guns to school. But that tells me something. That tells me that he wants to be there. But he has to live that life outside on the street. Bright, articulate, didn't want to get himself in trouble. He brings a gun.
And Chief Jaffe, so many people point to the so-called broken windows policing as leading to the increase in incarceration of youth. Is that true? And can you explain what broken windows policing is?
In general, broken windows is dealing with the small things so they don't manifest themselves into bigger things. You know, if you go back into the 1980s and early 1990s in New York City, we saw what we called wilding incidents in the city. It was plastered across every newspaper, every front page, 25 kids running through Times Square, beating up people, robbing people, and it put a lot of fear into the citizens in New York City, and government officials reacted to it. In the early 80s, we saw the crack epidemic in this city, and we saw a lot of people's behavior turn more violent. So there was a lot of fear, a lot of perception of victimization, and then the police department, city agencies decided to be tougher on crime going into the 1990s and being more assertive and aggressive in dealing with people that are involved in some type of not only illegal behavior, but behavior that could be interpreted as like harassment or disorderly conduct.
And do you see those arrests making the streets of New York City any safer?
Back then, I think they contributed to making them safer. Of course, when you work really hard and get people that are robbing people off the street and they go to jail and they stay in jail, in some ways that temporarily helps. It's like a Band-Aid. It's a short-term solution, but it's clearly not a long-term solution. As we heard earlier, 95% of people that go to jail get out of jail, and we as society have responsibility to deal with that. We have to think of these problems as long-term, not short-term.
And these juveniles, Adam, are entitled to defense as well, and you've defended many of them, though at some point in your life you thought you'd be more effective as being a prosecutor. That, to many, would sound counterintuitive. Can you explain why you made that decision and what you've seen as far as change along the lines?
As I started out sort of in law school and going through law school, I felt, I'm sure the same way a lot of people in this room do, that there was a problem in the criminal justice system, and a lot of it ended up having people going to jail that shouldn't be there, young people being in jail that shouldn't be there. And so I thought the best way to combat that would be a defender. What I realized through that experience is that as a defender, you're sort of powerless. You're asking all the time. You're asking the judge for something. You're asking the prosecutor for something. You're asking the probation officer for something. What I came to realize was that the prosecutor had all the power. It was the house if you were gambling. And I wanted that. And so to shift from trying to keep people out of jail as a defender, I'm trying to help kids stay out of jail, because our kids are no different than the young people that are here at John Jay. It's just the impediments to their success are so great that they need advocates on both sides to help them navigate that period of time.
And Anna, I want to get back to your research and the people that you've spoken with. As you mentioned, you spoke with a neurologist, and one of the characters in your play is a neurologist. And I think a lot of people don't spend enough time talking about the impact of trauma and what these children see day in and day out, what impact that has on their lives and their young brains as they are developing. Can you give us more insight into that? And also the attention that white young children receive compared to those of Latinos and African Americans?
Well, I would say that, first of all, I just want to pick up on something you said, Adam, which makes me think of a young man that I met in a facility outside of Washington who was talking about all the services that he gets when he's locked up. He's now 18 and he'd like to stay inside till he's 21, because when he goes back on the street, he won't have a mentor, he won't have a tutor, he won't have possibility of a job. And his only fear is that if he decides to stay in or do something else to come back in, they could send him anywhere they want, anywhere in the country that they want. But he's actually thinking about doing something where he can be assured of services. Otherwise, as he says, I'll be back on the streets robbing people, stealing cars, selling drugs. Doesn't really want to do that, right? So this idea of what happens before and after is so important. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion now of trauma. I was invited to be in a fireside chat at the White House with Valerie Jarrett on school discipline this summer, and I was surprised at how many people are taking this notion of school discipline and talking about trauma. So one of the people I perform is a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, and what they know is that, in fact, trauma is passed down generation to generation through DNA. And the good news is that people are paying attention to this now, and that there are ways to increase what's called brain plasticity. And actually, the research on that can help poor kids, but can happen that can help all of us who are over a certain age, right? So that there's actually benefits from looking at that which we would like to discard in terms of the overall well-being of everyone. And so I think that this work that I'm coming across is really about how to improve not just test scores, but mental and physical health of children, and all the money that we're spending on the back end, which this day deals with a lot. How about if we put that on the front end and really make schools places that can, you know, build lives and save lives.
And that mental, that's right. And that mental stimulation that you say children need and they crave, as we all know, and as experts suggest as well, applies to what you're doing, Judge Edward. Your program runs from 8 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. every day. It's so hard to keep these children occupied and preoccupied when they're not in school. Why is it so important to stay in school, and why have you extended it to even longer hours than most schools across the country? Tell me what you're doing in those schools.
Well, certainly in my mind, there are three pathways to being imprisoned. The first pathway is a lack of adult supervision. Secondly, too much idle time. And thirdly, economic constraints. And I can tell you that if any two of those exist in a child's life in any combination, that child will inevitably end up in prison. And so my job at Innovative Concept Academy is to try to eradicate at least two of those in any combination. So if I can provide the appropriate mental health services in school, the drug interdiction and treatment in school, if I can provide anger management in school, and if I can provide the appropriate tutorial, serious, compassionate folk to give our kids hope, give them an opportunity to understand what's expected of them and a realistic opportunity of getting there, then our kids will have the ability to succeed. And I'm happy to report that the judiciary, the court system, is starting to understand that. We're starting to understand that at the National State Courts Center. We're understanding that all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts, gave me an award, and he talked about black children and brown children and having an opportunity in education. But all of that came about because of People magazine, who decided to write a story on me, and all of a sudden, there was traction all over this country, and the judicial, the judges are starting to say, we have to address this implicit bias issue. We have to address all of these other issues that have impacted negatively black and brown children. And I'm pretty happy about that because there have been a lot of negative things coming out of Missouri in the last year and a half or so. And I'm very, very happy to say that we're going to take the lead on this whole issue with trying to stem and or eradicate zero tolerance in education for children.
Good for you, Judge.
But Judge, how can we not have you make a shout out for art? If what I read about you is right, you've got drama classes going.
I do.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, they've taken art out of the schools, so you need to campaign to bring it back.
One of the first places they cut funding,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Chief Jaffe, I think we all know that it's in society's interest to keep children in school and out of prisons. What is the NYPD doing to reduce the number of summons and school arrests? I know that you're starting to issue more warnings.
Right. So in the past couple of years, under the mayor's leadership, there was formed under the Criminal Justice Coordinator, a mayor's leadership task force to look at school-related issues. It involves the NYPD, the Department of Education, many other city agencies, and advocate groups. And we've changed philosophy of how we deal and address with, and so has principals in schools. And this is going on as we speak through our training, through our hiring practices, related to arresting, suspending students is up to the Department of Education. But for us, issuing summonses in school and arresting students. So over the past 4 years, our arrests and summonses of students are down like 70%, 65 to 70%. At the same time, 7 major crimes in schools in the city, 1.1 million students is down about 25%. We just embarked on a warning card program in 38 schools in the Bronx. They're in 5 separate buildings, but many schools under Department of Education have been combined, and we're doing a warning card program for students 16 years of age and older who would normally receive, say, a criminal court summons for possession of marijuana and/or disorderly conduct, and we're giving them a warning card, which is a piece of paper. A copy goes to the adult, the parent in their life, and also the Department of Education, and it's Department of Education's responsibility to then address the behavior. So in effect, they're not getting a criminal court summons, which if they don't appear, they then would be issued a warrant. Then when they have a warrant, if they're ever stopped again, they're getting arrested. So it hopefully thwarts the beginning of that cycle that could then perpetuate itself and make it worse after, worse and worse.
And that long process that you just described. But as the judge mentioned, I think people fail to think about the impact of many of these kids having double lives at home, at school, and what they see in both places. There's only so much that teachers and judges and folks like yourself can do to help these children and protect them. Some do fall through the cracks and pick up guns as well. Chief Jaffe, you've been working on powerful education to prevent this from happening. Before you tell us more about it, we have a short video we want to show you.
There is nothing you can do to make it right. And it's that fast, and it's over, and it's done, and you don't even know what you did. And by the time you understand, it is too late.
Wow.
So, I wish you could see that whole 6-minute video. I'll tell you that it's a TED Talk. But my experience in the housing developments, just to put this in context, I was the housing chief for 10 years, so we're talking 600,000 people, 334 developments in the city, one development, 50 buildings, 20 buildings. You're dealing with lower income, issues, all societal ills, by and large, that are affecting people in different ways in public housing. And then you have your cluster areas of public housing like East Harlem, Brownsville, and the South Bronx, where there's a tremendous amount of public housing in a very concentrated area. So, the issues that we saw, obviously, are gangs and crews, and the pull to get young people involved in the gangs and crews. And some of the young kids, a lot of them feel like they don't have a choice. They're doing it, it's survival. It's like the judge just said. We see, the disease that permeates these places, and not all of them, of course, is hopelessness and despair. And we have to work to take that hopelessness and despair and turn it into hope and dreams. And we have to affect these young children's lives. And we have to do it in different ways. We have to do it through the educational system. We have to do it through law enforcement. We have to do it through all the social service agencies and my partners in city government. So we do a lot in the New York City Police Department under the Community Affairs Bureau to address and to work to build relationships with young people. We have our summer camp, a youth police academy, thousands of kids for free, 6 weeks over the summer. We have the Explore program, 3,500 kids are involved with us. There are posts throughout schools and every precinct in PSA and transit district. But we also got involved with a gentleman named Dan Slepian who went to the mayor's office, and he was working with convicted murderers in Sing Sing, and that's what you just saw, a snippet of the video that he made. And convicted murderers in Sing Sing, there was altogether about 15 of them, and I had the opportunity to meet with them last year up at Sing Sing. They, after years and years in prison, they wanted to do something to give back. And they came together and went to their superintendent, Mike Capra of Sing Sing Prison, and said, we want to do something. And they created an art, music, and drama program in Sing Sing with these guys and a lot of other people. They're doing poetry. But they did a video, and the video was with Dan Slepian, who produced the 6-minute video, and there's a 4-minute TED Talk. And it's the Voices Within project. And these guys sat in a room with a video recorder by themselves and talked to young people about the consequences of picking up a gun, the consequences of violence and your actions, which we know young people, their brains are not fully developed, so they don't think through consequences and impulsivity. And these guys talked to them, they talked about themselves, and they talked to their victims and how they know they ruin people's lives. And so we in the police department got wind of this, and we started working with that video. And then we, the police department, did a second video. And we went out and we found young men, they're not so young anymore, say they're in their 30s, but who were also involved in criminal and gang activity. And they were all shot, and they're either quadriplegics or paraplegics. And we did a video, and that video is also on YouTube, so you could see it. And we spoke to them, and we asked those 3 guys who were willing to participate in this program with us, the police department, if they would talk to young people, and what would they say. And throughout the whole thing, it's stay in school. Don't let the streets eat you up. Fast money ain't good money. And those are just quotes. But it's all about the educational system and listen to the adults in your life. So we took these 2 videos and we started training people in the New York City Police Department on how to facilitate discussions with young people in all the different communities. So it could be a school setting. If we had the opportunity to bring only 15 kids together, Department of Probation is using it also. It could be in a school setting, it could be at meetings, it could be at a PTA meeting, but small groups, 2 hours, and use the video, not that it's gonna be the panacea, it's not gonna solve everybody, but to have these kids start talking and opening up.
It's a start. Well, it's great to hear that the NYPD is looking at innovative ways of changing the system and taking guns away from children's hands. So I want to thank this panel. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
American school, now we in church too. Shooting, we to pray, always shoot. I'ma be trail, you should be trail too. Shooting name of God, only time we just shoot. And I am so tired of being insecure. So sum it up, don't give a fuck. Light it on fire. Yeah. Yo, check. I am Sugar Ray Robinson, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm the modern one, yelling at senators, presidents, congressmen. We got a problem that needs some acknowledgement. I am no prison commodity, not just a body you throw in the cell for any reason just to bother me. Just for your quota, so it's rest in peace of Sean Bell. Sleep in peace, every Ghana, every street, every corner. Conspiracy, new order. I spoke to Tamir Rice's mama, she told me be strong. It won't be long till it's justice. They wanna vote for review the discussion on how certain cops they shoot us for nothing. Revolution is coming. You want like a change? The land of opportunity. Put me in change. The land of unity. I like to save it. Brotherhood, trust. It's still the same. America. Man, I like I made it up. You blaming us. To keep it 100, you hated named us. Nigga. You feeling change. 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 You see these shades. I can see a difference from how it used to be. Oh, feeling change.
Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the iconic entertainer, the warrior for social justice, a remarkable young man, Usher. So, what is this about? What's the meaning of what we just saw, Usher?
A vivid illustration of the reality of the world we live in, interpreted by way of using a platform that's been used for many, many years to acquire the attention for the sake of art. You said something. Art is an indispensable ingredient in the recipe for progress and change. What you saw is a product of what you said. Before we had even met, Agnes Gunn is who actually introduced us.
Who's in the audience today?
Introduced us, exchanging and having a private conversation. But great that our first encounter is in front of an audience who are advocating for the same rights. Social justice is something that isn't something I think that we should have to fight for. It is something that we all are entitled to. But a lot of the reality of what's going on in America and what's going on around the world is a social issue, is a social class issue as well. And a lot of times, from one side to the other, if you don't understand the problem, if you haven't faced the issue, how could you relate to it? Because that's not your reality. Your reality is defined by what you choose to pay attention to. And in a time when information is readily available, what we choose to look at, what we put on our social motors, what we choose or elect to invest time and interest in, that becomes our reality. But across town, in our inner cities, there's a reality that's being birthed that could someday affect you, could someday greet you, just like this, and take your life. Or cause a young man or a woman to then go down a spiral, losing the time that he or she has to be a great American, to be progressive and do something positive. I want to change that. Or at least I'd like to ignite you to investigate in that reality, for you to be inquisitive about it so that you could maybe change it. Maybe you could do some things to redefine that reality for those young men and women.
The thing I've always been inspired by with you, watching you, is a lot of artists have a somewhat superficial relationship with social issues, right? They all have a foundation because their PR people tell them you've got to have a foundation as a part of your brand.
Yeah.
But you're doing something different. I mean, as I have watched you mature into this remarkable leader, you are putting the pursuit of social justice and social change at the center of your brand, of who you are, your own identity. Why is that? And why aren't more artists doing what you are doing?
Oh, man. Well, first of all, philanthropy is cool, you know?
You make philanthropy cool. I don't. They don't say it's cool when I walk in the room. When you walk in the room, you change the conversation about philanthropy.
Well, I think I have to go back to my upbringing. And maybe there is some validity in the idea that lack thereof sometimes gives an opportunity for a greater perspective. And the men and women, or boys and girls, who were just like me at the age of 12, 13, and 14, in a time when I was very easily, or could have been very influenced by my reality. I didn't have a father in the house to tell me the difference between right and wrong. I had a mother who definitely made sure I stayed on a path of the straight and narrow. But it then gave me an opportunity to investigate and look out for what at the time was just considered motivation. I then recognized that what I was looking for was a mentor, someone to speak positivity into my life. There was something great about my grandmother and my grandfather giving me these fundamental mantras that, you know, you are a product of your environment. Who you choose to hang around, what you choose to surround yourself with, begets who you are and what your life trajectory may be. They didn't say it quite like that, but the point was that, you know, be careful of who you hang around. If you hang around gangsters and numbskulls, you're gonna end up in trouble, you know, and that track, I can't get you out of. You know, I can help you, you know, get up from mistakes and be there for you when you fall, but there's certain things that are out of my control. And when you choose to subject yourself to incidents that may change your life, you're gonna run out of time. Time is the most important thing that you could ever have. Don't waste it. Use it properly. Use it in the right way.
But when we talked the other day on the phone, we were talking about there are a lot of young brothers and sisters out there who don't have someone.
They don't.
And so we were talking about what was happening in Chicago and the gang, the black on black crime, and how people who are outside of our community look in and say, why are these black people killing each other? Why are all these gangs engaged in this kind of warfare that's just hurting their own people? And yet, often these young men and women are looking for community.
I think we're looking for community. I think that those young men and women, and by the way, I don't think I have one solution. Again, what I am hoping to do is ignite you to take interest in care and maybe invest in some young man or woman or boy or girl who could potentially go in the wrong direction or down a bad path, right? Through 501c3s or just adopting a kid, whatever it may have been. If you look at the idea of the community and how it's changed from when my parents or my parents' parents were being raised, it was a community. It was in some way tribal, right? Because if you got in trouble, I used to hear about this, and I actually took some of those whippings too as a kid.
You too, huh?
Yeah, but as a kid, it was a community effort to raise a child. And if you saw a group of kids going in the wrong direction, they then took the initiative to speak because it was an effort for the sake of community. In a lot of ways, I do feel like our communities have begun to fail us. And it's a systematic issue, or either a lack thereof, our taking ownership of our communities in that way to begin to change that idea. And I gave you the perspective that was mine, right? So for the young man or woman who doesn't have a father or mother or father or heavily abusers of narcotics or whatever it may be, they just are not available. So who is available for them? It's the gangs. It would be some man or woman who would say, hey, if you slang this dope, you know, hey, listen, it's short money. I mean, it's fast. It's good money fast. But the reality of what you're doing is you're putting yourself in a position where you could lose it all. Kids don't have that. They're not developed enough to even understand the reality of that until it's too late. But that, in a lot of cases, is the only sense of community or family or tribe that our young men or women have. And then as it relates to teen pregnancies for young women who just want love. You know, they look and then they're kind of lost. Obviously, there's many, many issues to unfold within the inner city. But in a lot of ways, I just think that the community may be failing us in some ways. And we need to work harder to build a better idea or a better perspective of what's available for our kids.
So let's talk about your philanthropy. So you've got a foundation called New Look?
The New Look Foundation, yes.
So what's New Look's mission? And talk about some of the programs that you have.
Well, one of the programs that we are very excited about launching in Atlanta, it's up and coming very, very soon, is a Spark Lab. Imagine an environment that's like the Silicon Valley for young men and women who are eager to change their community or eager to change issues that are affecting them. Or simply to give them the tools that they need to be leaders, to give them the ideas that they need to take on in order to begin to position themselves for success. Education, career service is something that we do focus on. Their talent and helping them find their spark. We call it the Spark Lab. It is a community effort. So the men and women, I call them men and women because we're raising future adults. We can call them kids, boys and girls, but the reality is we're raising future adults. What I'm hoping to do with my Spark Lab is to make them innovative, active young men and women, you know, to become disruptive innovators who find ways to communicate an idea or use art and some way of articulating themselves so that they can then put the information out about what's happening in their community, how they'd like to change it, the effects of it. Take, for instance, it's a young lady by the name of Mary Pat Hector. She's a Spelman student and a sought-after young activist in Atlanta, Georgia. She won a Peace Prize in Atlanta. There's a first Peace Prize in Atlanta. And what that gave her was an opportunity to fuel a campaign that she had about gun violence. So they put bulletins up all through these impoverished areas, and it basically shared statistics about what it was to think twice. The name of the campaign was Think Twice. And it's social active opportunities like that begin to not only empower them, but give credence to the idea that it's not just our responsibility, it's their responsibility. This is their community. They're taking control of it. They're becoming the future leaders. They're becoming these young men and women active in changing their future.
And do you consider yourself an activist? I mean, a lot of people today recoil, oh, I'm not an activist, I'm just doing my bit. What do you consider yourself?
I'm a human being who cares about my planet, who cares about people, who cares about, the reality of our children's future. If that makes me an activist and puts me in a position to be considered that, I'll take that on as another title.
But it's also true in some ways. You realize, I mean, you as a young black man in America sit in a very privileged position.
It doesn't mean things that I could choose to focus on. The same way I needed a mentor, the same way I needed someone to motivate me, that became my reality. I want to be that source for Mary. I want to be that source for Dewey. I want to be that source for men and women who feel like no one can hear or understand them. And all they need is the tools to understand how to be great or either apply themselves. I started that effort when I was 16 with the idea that the most influential role model for a child is a child. If I come into your school and I talk to you about what I could do, that's a point of reference. The community, television in a lot of ways, social media, it doesn't show positive images every second. As a matter of fact, we don't celebrate those images as much as we celebrate bullshit, So.
And why do you think that is? Because there's a lot of money to be made in celebrating bullshit.
Yeah, we gotta fill these fucking prisons up, or they do. It's a systematic issue that is a trap. It is the trap. And that's why I made the comparison and using the idea of change. I didn't want to be overbearing, but I wanted to shock you enough so that you could make the comparison. We as adults and they as young men and women who don't understand the reality of what incarceration is and what slavery was. I talked to a group of kids in Brooklyn yesterday, and we talked about the idea of slavery. And they had no association with it. They said, well, that's not a part of our culture. That's not who we are. That's not what we could relate to. It's happening. It just changed. It is our incarceration system that is enslaving you.
So what is your message to young, black, low-income, white, anybody in this country who is poor, we know, feels trapped in a system that is working against them? Are you hopeful?
I think we all are hopeful, correct? That's part of the reason why we're here. We're here because we're vying for a solution, and there's no one person in this room who has it. It's a collective effort. The one thing that I think is most important for all of us is to share in that concept of empathy, to understand one side to the other, that understanding of access. That's part of the reason why I even named the New Look Foundation The New Look. It's offering a new look on life through a real world experience. So if we just take 1 second and have empathy, this change is really an extension of a device that was created online where you have to go in and face the issue. There's a hashtag that went with it as well. Had to modernize our shit, Hashtag face the issue. But, you look into the eyes of the victims of these heinous crimes, and then you hear the music. And the moment that you turn away, because there was a study the other day, I think Oprah, she said that our attention span or attention to things it's now only captivating for about 8 seconds. At the rate of social media and how quick things are going on and how much shit we have going on in our own lives, we move on. We get upset, we're mad about something, and then we want to be active. We wear our hoodies, we wear our shirts, we put our hands up, and then we go back to our lives. We got to stop that. We have to be diligent and have to have the same discipline to continue to fight to be able to change this. And I ask you guys to please go look at this, because I want you to understand the effort, and I want you to talk about it. I want you to hashtag it, please, and spread it out as much as possible. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to stand on my soapbox as loud as I possibly can, but I can't do it without your help. I'm contributing to your effort. I want you to contribute to mine as well.
So as we wrap, let's return to where we started the conversation, art.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about Sankofa and your partnership with Daniel Arsham.
Yeah. Well, this effort in itself was a collaboration between Tidal, Sankofa, and Daniel Arsham. It is exactly as you said. It is the greatest ingredients. For many years, be it social change and the idea of influence through art has always kind of been the leading voice. And also, too, as a matter of fact, is the one voice that lasts longer than everything that we may say or we may hear, because it's a visual illustration that depicts a time, an effort, a focus, an idea. And that's what art has been and will be. I choose to use it in this way, and I engage other artists, other musical artists, other men and women of influence to not only invest, but also to do the same.
So before we leave, there is in fact an Amnesty International, USA's Art for Amnesty
that is correct.
exhibition that premieres tomorrow.
Yes, I invite you guys.
So Usher invites you to join him tomorrow at Urban Zen, downtown on Greenwich Street, for the unveiling this exhibition that you have put your weight behind.
Yes.
But as our friend Agnes said after her last encounter with you, she said, when you spend time with Usher, you are inspired and feel hopeful about tomorrow. And I think we all here share that sentiment. Thank you. Please give it up for Usher.
Everyone, my name is Maria Hinojosa. It's good to be here with you today. How many of you, having just watched that, are pretty shocked by the numbers and the data? If you're shocked by that and just kind of surprised, can you applaud? So how many of you were aware of those numbers and statistics? Okay, so equal measure. Then the name of this panel is Immigrants in Terror. And it is a particular moment in our American history where we are sitting on this panel today with an amazing group of people. And yet today, right now, there are people just like you and me who are literally living in terror in our country, right now. In Long Island, there are people who are afraid to come out of their homes. Why? Because of the immigrant raids that have intensified and were announced during Christmas time. So we have to understand that there is a particular kind of terror that we are all living with, and it's not far away. It's literally, we can touch it. In fact,
right here on this campus, there are young people who have family members or friends who are living in that terror. So while people talk about mass incarceration, the whole conversation about immigrant detention and what we call at Latino USA and Futuro Media Group, the ICE industrial complex. It's not something that we see, it's not something that we know, that we touch, and yet for people right now, it is very real, and it's happening under our watch. The three people I'm joined with on stage, honestly, I'm so honored to be with them. First, Adama Ba, who was detained by authorities, by immigration authorities, for presumed terrorist activity, which was unfounded. Later it was found out that it was entirely unfounded. And she was 16 years old. She was a high school kid when they came to get her. Thank you, Adaba, for being here. Khalil Cumberbatch was held for 6 months in an immigrant detention center before he received a pardon from Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's now an activist for social justice, and actually Adama is a mom of 2 cute little girl and a boy, so she's busy. And also joining me is Layli, who is the head of the Tahrir Center, it's Layli Miller-Muro, who is the founder and executive director of the Tahiri Justice Center, and she's been working with immigrants, women and children fleeing violence in their homelands. So let's start with you, Adaba. Just paint a picture. You're 16 years old. You're a sophomore, junior in high school?
Yes, junior.
Here in New York City?
New York City.
Okay. And what happens?
Well, I should start by saying that I came to this country at the age of 2 years old. I came with my mother. And
you were born where?
We're originally from Guinea-Conakry, which is in West Africa. And I lived a normal life. And until the age of 16 years old, officers came and raided my home, FBI, ICE, which is also known as Immigration.
What time did they come?
It came early in the morning, about 6 a.m.
Were you kind of...
I was still in bed. I was still sleeping. So they came in the bedroom and frightened all of us and woke us up and told us all to go to the living room.
Did they identify themselves?
Not to me, no. But my mother said they did identify. I'm only 16. Even if you did identify yourself, I wouldn't know who you are.
Okay.
So we went into the living room, and we're watching them just rumbling around in a house looking for something. And I'm unsure what they're looking for. And they're yelling at my mom in the bedroom. People are yelling, and I don't know what's going on. I'm just scared, nervous. First reaction, I start asking my sibling in my language, what's going on? What are they doing? And they're like responding, and the officer tells us, shut up, or only speak English.
But they never, you don't remember, your mom told you that they had a warrant, that they said, this is who we are, this is what we're doing here, this is what we're looking for, and we have a legal right to be in your home? Was that ever presented?
They have never presented to me, no. As for my mother, I do not know what was presented to her, but that was never presented to me.
Long and short, you end up spending 6 weeks in a detention center.
As they came to the house, they detained myself and my father, and they took us to the detention center. I spent 6.5 weeks, and my father was ultimately deported.
And you haven't seen him since?
He actually just came back in 2011.
So he's back, and he was able to return?
Yes, he's able to return.
That's kind of amazing.
Yes.
That's amazing, but that's a separate part of this story. Just so we understand, you were in detention for 6 weeks, and then after that, not how many days, not how many months, how many years did you have an ankle shackle on your ankle?
I had to wear the ankle bracelet for 3 years. As I said, I did not know I was here illegally until I was 16 in handcuffs. And they were threatening to deport me, and deported me to Guinea, a country that I've never been to, a country that I don't know. I do know the language and I do know the culture, but again, I don't know the laws of that land. I'm American, so.
We'll talk a little bit about that decision, especially since in Adaba's case, everything was unfounded, but the decision to why put on an ankle shackle for 3 years. and if there's a profit motive there. But Kalief, let's talk a little bit about your case. You were in the country with a green card. You committed a crime at some point when you were younger, like a lot of young kids, right? You served your time, so you completed your sentence, and you were living your life, right? And then what happens? How long after you had actually finished your sentence, how long after did something change for you?
So it was about 4 years after my release from prison. I had successfully completed parole and completed an undergraduate degree and was 1 week away from completing a graduate degree when a very similar story. My wife and I got a knock on our door around 7 o'clock in the morning, and we also have 2 young children. So 7 o'clock in the morning, there's a lot of hustle and bustle in the house, and we were getting ourselves ready for our day and getting ready to get our daughters up out of their slumber. And we get a knock on the door, and we look outside, and my wife says that it's the police. And they had jackets that identified themselves as police. And as for someone, it's very different for someone who has criminal justice involvement, because although I had successfully completed parole, you always know that they have the ability to do this, that you're never really out of the criminal justice system. And although I had successfully completed parole and I had all of these things accomplished, I knew for a fact that they could just come to my home and ask me a question. And therefore, when police were or what they identified to be police were at the door, it wasn't really a surprise. My wife and I opened up the door, and it was in our living room that they told me and my wife the real reason that they were there, who they were really there for, on behalf of, and what their purpose was.
So when you opened the door, they never said, Mr. Cumberbatch, we are from Immigration Customs Enforcement, and we are looking for you.
As a matter of fact, they had never identified themselves as Immigration Customs Enforcement officers until after they had told me the reason they were there, that they actually said that we were here to apprehend you. Oh, and by the way, we're here on behalf of Immigration Customs Enforcement, an entity of Department of Homeland Security.
Okay. So why were they detaining you? What does one case have to do with another? You had actually served your time. Why now were immigration agents coming to look for you?
So I guess the short answer is that it's double jeopardy. I think that the more complicated answer is that my criminal conviction put me in the same category in terms of immigration policy as someone who is known to be a threat to national security, or someone who has known to commit some terrorist act. The fact that I had a robbery in the first degree put me in this group of this category called aggravated felonies, which I should note that crimes within that category do not have to be aggravated and they do not have to be felonies, but mine happen to fall in that. And because I had fell into that category, it put me at the top of the list in terms of who they were targeting to detain and deport.
So even though the Obama administration has stressed that they are only going after hardened criminals, in fact, even though you had served your time, you were on the list.
Yeah, so the mere fact that I had a felony conviction, despite everything that I had accomplished after that felony conviction, during my incarceration and post-incarceration, which I should note that it was the same items that the government actually ended up acknowledging and ended up using as the reason to release me, were the same things that they refused to take into consideration in the beginning of my immigration proceedings.
Okay, and we're going to come back and talk about what it was like to be in a detention center versus being in a prison, a bureau of prison. There is, as we saw in the video, it's a very different reality. There is an entirely separate legal system that is the immigration legal system that is handled entirely differently than the criminal justice system. So these basic things, and I'm saying that over and over again because these are basic things that we believe in criminal justice and due process in our country, kind of basic. People are identifying themselves and they're telling you why they're there. So Layli, just give us a couple of like top of the line responses to the legal rights that actually not just them or myself as somebody who was also not born in this country, but actually what everybody else who may think, well, it's immigrants, maybe that's not me. Actually, what does this have to do with them in terms of violations of due process, basic civil rights, those kinds of basic ideas of rights?
Well, I mean, I think we grow up, if we go to school in the United States, we have a fiction that there's a Bill of Rights and that the Bill of Rights applies to people who live in the United States. But that's a fiction, because in fact, the entire Bill of Rights does not apply equally to everyone in the United States. There's a hierarchy of rights and who gets them, and if you are a lawful permanent resident entitled to be here, as both of you were, there's a lesser degree of due process rights that you're entitled to. But God forbid you are a refugee, you're undocumented, and you're fleeing for your life from Central America, for example, and you cross the Texan border, you're placed in incarceration. There are 100,000 children who have fled the border, over our border over the last 2 years, fleeing violence. They are refugees under US and international law. They're entitled to be here. And we incarcerate them in jail conditions with no access to legal representation.
What are the first things that the children tell you when they get into custody, into immigrant detention centers on the U.S.-Mexico border? Do you know what the word is that they use for the place where they are put, where they are held?
Hieleras, they're ice boxes.
Hielera. Hielera, which means refrigerator or ice box. This is what the children know is the place where they're put when they first are come into contact with immigration
But actually, it's not the children. It's Border Patrol themselves. Border Patrol calls it that. So when they're saying to you, we're bringing you into detention, it is a phrase they have coined.
Wow.
It is a reality they have designed, and they threaten people with these ice boxes. They then put them into them. Their lips turn blue. They become chapped. Their fingers turn blue. They take out their outer garments. They're given no sanitary napkins, no personal items. 20 women and children are placed in one place for days at a time. The lights are kept on. They don't know whether it's night or day. There's one toilet in the corner that's public to everybody, and 4 sanitary napkins that are given for 20 women at one time. People are stained in blood, people are stained in urine, and they're given sandwiches 2 times a day that they have to grab in order to get, and 1 thermos that's placed there with water that smells like bleach and burns their throats.
And this is happening today.
This is happening every day to thousands and thousands of people. And there's $1 billion private industry that's benefiting from this. The GeoCorp and the Corrections Corporation of America, which are incarceration companies, are making millions of dollars over these detention facilities at our southern border, which are housing children. And by the way, a long time ago, we figured out children shouldn't be in jail. Young kids don't deserve to be in jail. It's not good for their mind. It's not good for their bodies. They become sick. A woman, for example, who might be a convicted felon is not allowed to raise her child in jail. But starting for the first time in the United States in July of 2014, the Obama administration began jailing children and their mothers coming across the border. And last August, a federal judge said that is illegal and you're not allowed to do it, and ordered them to stop, and they still haven't.
Khalil, what's going on for you right now as you're hearing this, the litany of the violations?
Yeah, I have to watch my language, what's really going on in my mind. I was in that icebox. I mean, I was not in the facility that you're talking about. I was held in a correctional facility, which was a Hudson County correctional facility in Kearney, New Jersey. And when you first come in, that's exactly where they put you. They put you in these housing units that they call the icebox. They keep the temperature low on purpose. The air conditioner is running constantly, regardless of the time of year. And for those who know, even with central air, maybe some of the students here know any building that's central air, it's always either or, right? It's either really, really warm or really, really cold. And when you're exposed to that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for what could be potentially months or years, it has a physical effect on you. So I remember actually sitting in that icebox and covering myself with 2 blankets, and the officer asking me very sarcastically why I had on 2 blankets, knowing very well that herself was wearing 2 jackets. But it was really just a way to show you from the very beginning of your process in immigration detention that you are less than a human being and that you're not deserving to even have any comfort such as body warmth.
Why did they say why did you believe that they treated you as, or thought of you as less than a human being? Was there a term that they used, or what would they say that?
Yeah, I think any term that's used that takes away a person's humanity, felon, inmate, detainee, immigrant, anything that refuses to acknowledge a person's humanity is something that is degrading. And from the time that you come into immigration detention, they make it known that you are a detainee. And there's a whole bunch of connotations that come with that, but one of them that are made very clear is that you do not have control over yourself, and therefore you do not have control over the environment.
Did they call you, did they say that you were an illegal?
I can't remember anyone saying that I was here illegally.
No, that they actually, because that's something that we've heard in our reporting in the detention centers in Arizona and in Texas, that, you know, you're illegal and therefore you don't have any rights. But let me ask you, Adaba, what was your understanding of why I mean, this happened 10 years ago. You're so beautiful. You have an amazing, beautiful face and smile. How have you come to terms with the fact that what happened to you was actually propagated by the American government on a 16-year-old girl with little proof after everybody has watched Making of a Murderer on Netflix, you know, and everybody's thinking about where these accusations come from? How have you processed this?
As a 16-year-old, it's impossible to process it. I knew once I came out, I had to live reality that my father's not here, and I have siblings dependent on me. So I had to get up, and I had to move on. I've never really gotten a chance to relax and say, okay, to start the healing process, okay? Because I have never received an answer as to why I was detained or why this happened to me, especially as a 16-year-old. So I'm still processing it.
And has anyone, so there's never been a recognition, any kind of follow through with you?
No apology, no follow-up, no, oh, the reason why we detained you is so, no, nothing.
And what's it like for you to be here on this stage speaking about this?
Well, this is important for me because there are 16-year-olds out there, maybe your children are out there, and they're waiting to pick them up one day. You don't know who's next. And unfortunately, I lived in a fairy tale thinking that no one would ever arrest me. No one can imagine something like that. So as a mother now, I have to think about my children. They're American citizens, but will they ever come for them? Will they ever say, oh, because they're Muslims, oh, because they're blacks, or because of this? What is the next excuse?
So there are all kinds of humanitarian due process issues that we've talked about, which are very impactful, right? When you realize that right now, in this very day, there are people who are being held without understanding why, which to me is kind of a violation of, what is it, the Fourth Amendment? But, you know, not understanding why you're being held. Due process violations, human rights, but let's just talk for a moment about the money. So we know now that the entire budget of immigration detention enforcement now is actually a budget that is larger than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. So let's just sit with that for a moment. More money is spent today, more of your tax dollars is spent today in federal immigration detention and enforcement than all federal law enforcement combined. FBI, DEA. Is that possible, Layli? Because I think a lot of people...
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because, I mean, you know, people might say, well, they're flight risks, terrorist risks, you know, whatever the rationale may be given for detention is completely false. When you look at the people in detention, and I want to call out a racial issue too. I mean, we don't detain illegal Canadians. We don't detain people who overstay their visas from other countries. There are many, many others. And it's the people who are detained who have brown and black skin, darker skin, who have less money, who are less able to access attorneys. But in terms of what's effective, there is a 98% compliance rate with immigration court appearances and everything that they're supposed to do to be compliant with immigration status when they have legal advocates and legal representation. And there's no need for an ankle bracelet. It's ineffective and it's expensive. It costs $300 a day to detain an immigrant in detention, and there's no need for it. But this industry spent $25 million last year alone lobbying for the system we have now. They benefit from it, and their lobbyists are more well paid than the nonprofits. They have a bigger budget than the nonprofits like us, who are advocating on the other side for humanitarian treatment and due process rights.
We're wrapping up here, but just briefly from each of you, why do you think that this issue has not connected? We are not, this is not front of mind, and oftentimes when I speak to people and interview people, they just say, well, they're here illegally, therefore who kind of cares? From each of you, why do you think it hasn't pushed through, and what do you want to leave the audience with in terms of what their responsibility is in this? And Adaba, let's start with you.
I think for someone like myself, I suffered because my parents brought me here, but I suffer for that consequence. And it's not fair for people who don't know their rights. It's something that we have to tackle. It's because it never happened to you, you won't understand. Because it didn't happen to your loved one, you won't look into it. So let's avoid other families from being separated and look into immigration reform.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. For me, I think that when we talk about immigration detention, we're not I think it's important, and I want to leave the audience with this, is that we're not talking about a separate system. We're talking about a system that is heavily intertwined with what we call the criminal justice system. And as a matter of fact, that system feeds another system. So that's a point that I want to leave the audience with. At the organization I work for currently as the manager of training and communications, Just Leadership USA, was founded by Glenn Martin, who often says that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, yet farthest from resources and power. And I think that conversations like this is really important to have the voices of those who are impacted, because those are the ones who are going to be at the forefront and need to be at the forefront of any type of reform, particularly when we talk about immigration detention, because it is such an insidious system and most people do not, quote unquote, survive it, to tell their stories, that is something that is required for us to kind of share our experiences from the perspective that something needs to be done, because this is not an immigrant problem, this is not a Muslim problem, this is not a Canadian problem, but this is an American problem, right? And we are the ones who are actually funding this system.
Thank you.
I want us to be really careful about how we use the word illegal. You were legal, and you did nothing wrong. The women and children at the border are refugees fleeing extreme violence in Central America. What we are doing to them is tantamount to jailing and punishing someone who's fleeing a burning building because they accidentally jaywalked to get to the other side of the street, even when there was a law on the books that said you're actually allowed to jaywalk if you're fleeing a burning building. That's what our refugees laws are. That's what international humanitarian law is. They've done nothing wrong, actually. They're coming here seeking protection, and we owe them our compassion and our mercy, but at least we owe them following our own laws, and we're breaking them.
Thank you so much to Layli, Khalil, and Adaba, and thank all of you for being here and for having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I'm Pamela Thomas Graham. I'm the chair of new markets at Credit Suisse, and I have to say the discussions so far this morning have been absolutely riveting. I really applaud Tina Brown and her live media team, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and the Ford Foundation for their hard work convening us to share such a vital series of conversations. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you are wondering why a bank executive, particularly from an institution that's headquartered outside of the United States, is even interested in an event like this. And it's a reasonable question with a fairly simple answer. As we heard from so many speakers and panelists already today, the state of American justice has a major impact on many facets of our society, including our economy. So being part of a discussion of the urgent issues surrounding our justice system makes sense for businesses of all kinds. As employers, as corporate citizens in New York City, and as leaders of global institutions committed to fostering economic growth and wealth creation, every business leader has a lot of skin in the game here. As a financial institution, we have a particular interest in ensuring that the communities in which we live and work and offer our services are healthy and vibrant, and economic opportunity and advancement can't be maximized in a society unless all of its members are offered the same resources and opportunities to reach their full potential. At the bank, we're always thinking about authentic and innovative ways to accelerate economic progress in all communities, particularly among entrepreneurs, which led us to a discussion about what the barriers are to economic progress in each community and deepened our interest in learning more about the issues we're talking about today. They clearly have a major impact on the ability of our nation to progress and to live up to its full economic potential. Employers of all kinds can be part of the coalition working to address the issues we're discussing today. In fact, you could argue that we can't achieve the best outcomes without the active support and engagement of business leaders across the country. On a personal note, the issues that we've been discussing today resonate very deeply with me. I grew up in Detroit, in the city, not in the suburbs. And as a young black girl growing up during a time of significant economic change for the city and for our community, I know how thin the line can be between success and failure. I was really lucky to have two parents committed to each other and to hard work and who were willing to make the sacrifices necessary to provide a great education for me and my brother. I was lucky to have a church community and a school community to support the dreams that my parents had for me and that I had for myself. But all around me were unfortunate examples of the opposite. There were people who faced very steep challenges without that kind of support, and who, as a result, sometimes made bad choices that took them permanently off track. So I know personally how much talent, particularly young talent, can be lost to the criminal justice system and how urgent the need is to find ways to break the cycle that some young Americans find themselves in, making one bad choice and then not being able to earn their way back into being a functioning and productive member of our society. So how do we solve these issues? The conversation will now turn squarely to solutions, and we'll spend some time learning and talking about effective ways to rebuild communities. I'm really excited for us to engage in that important conversation, to hear about the innovative ideas and solutions that are already in place to try to reverse this cycle of poverty, crime, and incarceration in our hardest hit cities. I know that all of you here today are going to be a part of the solution. Thank you for being a part of today's summit.
There are millions of people throughout this country that, through no fault of their own, are not getting to realize their potential. They are not yet living an American dream that other millions have.
All right. Well, hello, friends. My name is Joshua Dubois. And for the next few minutes, we're going to have a conversation about starting over. You know, the issues that we've been discussing this morning and the issues that many of you all work on every single day, individually they're challenging, but when you thread them together, they can feel pretty overwhelming. Our complicated racial past as connected to the living present for so many Americans, unemployment, which leads to poverty, which leads to crime, our broken criminal justice system and immigration system that, again, many of you all are working to fix. Many communities are facing all of these at the very same time. And that can sort of lead to a climate of despair in a lot of places, and a question that a lot of folks have, is it even possible to turn the page, to flip the script, to start over? Well, the folks on this stage would say, yes, it is possible. It's hard, but it's possible. And they're going to share with us some insights, some ideas, and some stories from their own lives that illustrate how we start over. We have joining us Shirley Franklin, the former mayor of Atlanta and the executive chairman of Purpose-Built Communities. We have Glenn Martin, the executive director of Just Leadership. Dr. Bruce Perry, a national expert in trauma and the founder of the Child Trauma Academy. And Rosie Perez, the activist and philanthropist and actor and Brooklyn's finest as well. Thank you for joining us, Rosie. Now, we're going to talk about your individual stories and work, but just first a level-setting question. What does a healed, whole community even look like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? I don't know if a lot of us have the answer to that, but based on the examples from your own work and from your own lives, what does a started over community look like? Mayor Franklin, maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I would say in our work at Purpose-Built Communities, it's a community that is sustainable and healthy economically, where families are able to thrive, where there's social mobility, excellent schools, community assets that support people in need, that's safe, and over a period of time, you see people able to improve their own lives with the help of the broader community.
Yeah. Glenn, what do you think?
I think that it's not rocket science. I think that for every community that's ravaged by crime, mass incarceration, and mass criminalization, there are other communities that lean up against those communities that enjoy all of the things that you mentioned in your question. I live here in New York, and I tend to, when I do run, I run down Fifth Avenue, and if you start in the hood, you hit this point where you look up and you see the Ralph Lauren Polo Mansion, and you're still on Fifth Avenue. The housing stock looks the same, but you're suddenly in a very safe community. That's because safety has little to do with police officers and guard towers and all the things that we invest in communities that are high crime. We seem to mobilize law enforcement immediately after crimes in those communities, whereas other communities have so many other things that are mobilized for them every single day: education, healthcare, employment, access to good wages. Those are the things that keep communities safe. If I told this audience to close their eyes and think about the safest day in their lives, I doubt many people would open their eyes and talk about shotguns and police cruisers. And so I would urge us to look closely at what we're doing for other communities and realize that those are some of the things that can help these communities be whole and safe.
So look at the healing that exists in other communities and model from that. Rosie, what does a healed, whole community look like, feel like to you when you think about that?
I'm close to it, literally.
Yeah.
I think I embody that, and I feel that I don't think that a community that has been injured and been tainted and been struck down by poverty and crime fully heals, right? But that said, there is room for healing, and the healing process can be continued and nurtured and continue to grow. And for me, it all starts with education. I think that's one of our last civil rights issue, is a comprehensive, well-balanced, fair, and challenging education. And that's not the case. He talks about going down Fifth Avenue. If you start at a public school where you're starting out, it's crap. You go down by Ralph Lauren, it's amazing. That shouldn't be in the United States of America. We're supposed to be one for all for one. We're supposed to be about equality and the pursuit of happiness. And if you are injured coming out of the gate, when you enter kindergarten or even nursery school, right there you're at a disadvantage. Yeah. And so I think that a healed community is a community that provides excellent education and an education system that provides a community.
Yeah.
In the sense that, Mayor de Blasio has this school initiative of making our schools a community-based school where your parents could come in and get helped on resumes to get a better job. You can go in and get an eye exam. You don't have to go and wait into a crappy Medicaid office, or what have you. Or wait till you're really sick and go into the emergency room. You have, psychological advantages inside your school. The children can seek therapy. The family can seek therapy. All of these things, I think that, we can talk about aesthetically how things look, but I would love to talk about a community who is healed internally.
Yeah.
And then that starts the conversation from there.
So it's a process, but internal healing with education at the heart. Bruce, what does a healed whole community feel like?
Well, talk about a tough question. I come at this from a somewhat different perspective because I'm a neuroscientist and I'm a physician, and I've worked with maltreated children and families that are struggling in all parts of the world. And one of the things that we've come to see over the years in visiting indigenous communities in Australia that are just struggling with terrible poverty and transgenerational racism and overt genocide and then cultural genocide. And we see this in the First Nations people in Canada. We see this in different ways in communities throughout the US. But within all of these different communities, there are these interesting examples of health, even when there's no money. Even when there's no support from government. And the thing that emerges as the powerful principles that emerge are pretty simple. Just like you said, it's really not rocket science. It's about relationships. A community that has relational wealth is able to tolerate stressors and heal from past stress. A community that has relational poverty, no program, no amount of money, no amount of infusion of people from the outside is going to make that happen. So healthy communities have rhythm, healthy communities have relationships, healthy communities have respect. And those three things create a climate of safety where people can meet their potential.
Rhythm, relationships, and respect. I like that. Shirley, back to you for a minute. Now, you all had to do some significant healing work in Atlanta in a community called Eastlake, I believe. Tell us a little bit about what Eastlake was like back in the day before you launched a pretty intensive redevelopment process. Talk to us about Eastlake.
Well, 20 years ago, Eastlake was known as Little Vietnam in Atlanta. I worked for Andrew Young in his administration. It was the one neighborhood I wouldn't go into alone. Police didn't want to go, fire didn't want to go, postal workers didn't want to go. The crime rate was 18 times the national average. The student achievement rate among elementary schools was in the lowest percentiles in the state. It was a community that where people really did not have the kind of relationships, did not have access to first quality education, didn't feel safe in their own homes. They were 95% of the people who lived in Eastlake were victims of felony. So they were being preyed upon by others. So this was a community that was in complete disrepair. And the community was built around a public housing neighborhood. And our founder got interested in it, actually reading about Rikers Prison and this whole story about that, and started calling around Atlanta, and decided to, Tom Cousins decided to dedicate his philanthropic effort to helping this community to rebuild. And out of that came what we call the Eastlake model, or the purpose-built model, which is built around bringing together leaders across sector, private sector and public sector, heavy influence of local residents in defining what is a healthy community for them. And the tenets of that are having a not-for-profit or a community quarterback that helps to implement the kinds of plans that come out of such work. Focused on education, builds on pretty much everything that's been said. The school, which was underperforming, is now one of the top performing schools in the state and in the city. Started with a school of less than 300 students, now has 1,700. Started 6 weeks old, go all the way to the 11th grade, and we'll graduate our first class next year. A real focus on education, education excellence for every single child, regardless of their background, regardless of what their needs are, but making sure that every child can succeed. And then you add to that housing, mixed income housing, and community programs.
And at the heart of that was a connection between community leaders and the business community, right? Tell us about
No
Eva
question.
and Tom. How did
Well,
they come
Eva
together?
Davis was, we have three founders. Tom Cousins, who was a philanthropist and a businessman, built his own business. Renee Glover, who was the head of the Housing Authority, who was looking for solutions. And Eva Davis, who was the tenant leader. And the three of them and a small group of people labored to get to know each other over 2 years. I use the word labored as a polite term. Labored and worked to get to know each other so that they would trust each other enough to embark on this community transformation. And Eva Davis was a very, very strong leader at the local level, known across the state for her leadership skills, grassroots leadership skills. And ultimately, she was an appointee on the Housing Authority and an advocate for this transformation, and lived in the transformed community or the new community until her death a few years ago.
Wow.
But she says that she was living in hell, these are her words, and that she was now in paradise, that this was a community where everyone had a chance to succeed.
And let's sort of look at hell in paradise, so to speak. I believe we have some photos of Eastlake before this transformation and after, if we want to bring it up. There's some before photos and another. And let's show what Eastlake looks like now.
Wow.
There we go.
Awesome.
Joshua, would I just add that, I mean, the physical transformation is such that you would not believe the earlier statistics if you drove through.
Wow.
But the transformation of a community with leaders and respect and collaboration and partnership is really what will sustain it.
Yeah. So go visit Eastlake. Bruce, I want to come to you next, and we're going to keep all of our comments relatively brief so we can make sure to get to everyone. This is a sort of macro level change, but it starts with individuals, right? And you have really looked into the impact of trauma on people's lives, particularly on children, and how that plays into the challenges they face later in life. Talk to us about why we need to understand trauma to turn around, to start over.
Well, I think it was mentioned earlier that one of the things that's emerging sort of in the neurosciences is an understanding of the power of experience in shaping how your brain organizes. And I think most people kind of know this, but one of the things that we're learning more and more about is how unpredictability, chaos, overt threat, significant exposure to violence changes your stress response system. And now there's a lot to that, but one of the core problems with that is that if you're really, really tuned up and you have this continuous state of sort of fear that you're living with, when you go to school, even if it's a good school, you can't learn very well because parts of your brain that would normally be open for learning are shut down because your brain's saying, that's not that important right now. What's really important is who's connected to who, what's going on outside there, am I going to get hurt? And so when I said rhythm, the reason I said rhythm is that anybody who feels dysregulated, if you move, if music, rhythmic conversation, relational connection, all these things quiet your stress response system and make you capable of learning. And so,
you saying that hip hop heals?
Absolutely. I am saying hip hop heals.
Yeah,
I am saying you can learn more lines of text in rhythm than you can if it's straight prose. You know, they would tell me that they'd have these kids. They'd say, "This kid's illiterate. He's got no cognitive issues and blah blah blah, and he can't read." And then I'd start talking with him, and I'd say, "Do you know any music?" And he'd spit out like 25 lines of rhyme, and I go, "There's nothing wrong with this kid's brain.
Yeah.
This kid hasn't been regulated enough. He hasn't been taught the right way."
Absolutely. Rosie, I'd love to come to you next. You know, many folks know your work in Hollywood. I have to say, White Men Can't Jump, one of the best comedies of all time. Can I get some agreement there? But you've also been working, sometimes behind the scenes, helping kids who have endured some really tough times based in your own experiences. You went into the foster care system at 3 years old, and that's really shaped your later work. Tell us about your life growing up and about your work now in arts education.
Well, first of all, the arts education organization that I'm with is Urban Arts Partnership.
Yeah.
And we work only with Title I schools, only public schools. And we service over 100 public schools in New York and over 15,000 kids per year.
Wow.
And part of creating the organization, what was very important to me was that, one, we go to the kids. We go to the problem. We don't make the kids work to get help. The other thing was that no child could ever be kicked out of our organization. It's voluntary, but once you're in there, regardless of your behavior, we don't condone bad behavior, but we don't punish it either, in the sense of kicking a kid out and making them feel worse about themselves. For me, also what was important was understanding the stress factors that a kid from poverty has to deal with. You're inside your home, you probably got beaten last night, or you didn't have a good meal. You can't concentrate, maybe your lights are off. You're by the stove trying to keep warm, if your gas and electricity is on. When you wake up in the morning, you probably don't have any food to eat, so you want to hurry up and get to school so you can have a decent meal, but you have an anxiety attack because you're embarrassed that you have the free lunch ticket, and you're embarrassed because you have holes in your shoes, I did, and you're exhausted because you can't afford a MetroCard. So by the time you walk in the door, and maybe if you live in an abusive home, you're sneaking to get to the bathroom so you can avoid maybe your parent or your sibling or whomever's in the house from sexually molesting you. And these are realities. This was my reality. So by the time you walk into school, you're a nervous wreck. You're a nervous wreck, and you're absolutely right. Your main concern is that you do not want to get hurt anymore. And so a teacher will look at you and immediately label you as a problem child. So in Urban Arts Partnership, it was very, very important to me that we create arts ed integrated curriculums that not only help kids comprehend the academics, but also help kids with their psychological issues, with their self-esteem issues, with knowing that they have a safe environment to go to, that people actually care, and also offer programs that teach them in a different way, because every single kid is different. When I was in the foster care system, I was a ward of the state, I was property of the Catholic Church as well. Every time I went to public school, I was labeled, I was ostracized, and it hurt. For someone, a kid who's 5 years old, that's just too much to bear with. Yeah. So by the time I was in 3rd grade, I was very angry, and if you looked at me wrong, I'd punch you in the face. I'd be sent to detention time and time and time and time again. So I would fall back on my studies, I would walk back into school thinking that I'm a loser, and from the grace of God, by the grace of God, when I went to a different school, and there was a principal, Mr. Sanchez was his name, I'll never forget him. And he wasn't in the city, he was actually upstate, because that's where the institution was. It was Brinkerhoff. And Mr. Sanchez, they took me to his office, and he asked me what was wrong. And I said, nothing. And he was just silent, and the tears started to come down. He closed his door, he gave me a tissue, he goes, you want to stay here for the rest of the day? I said, sure. And I stayed in the principal's office for the rest of the day. He walked me back to class holding my hand. I felt so special. I felt like somebody cared about me. He took the teacher outside in the hallway, and I heard him reprimanding the teacher.
Wow.
That's what I'm talking about.
And so
and
Rosie,
for the urban arts, I want to finish this because it's very, very important. We teach kids in different ways. We use hip-hop music. We also use R&B music, and we're going to start using country music, too, because we don't want to ostracize anybody out of the conversation.
Inclusive environment over there, absolutely.
We have a wonderful program called Fresh Prep, right? Fresh Prep breaks down the Regents exam, which is an exam in high school that you have to take in order to graduate from high school. We get kids that have failed that exam 5 to 10 times. I am not lying. They're in public school. You can stay in school until you age out. Literally, there's 20-year-olds who are seniors or juniors or sophomores in our public school systems. They take Fresh Prep. We break it down into hip-hop songs, interactive play games, and word play games. 3-week course, they pass the exam. Wow. We have an 85% success rate.
And the beautiful thing is, Rosie, you know, the depth of challenges that you walk through in your life, that turnaround moment with that principle, but also just your own human spirit. Now you're able to pull all of that hurt and pain and let it inform the work that you're doing now with Urban Arts Academy. Thank you so much for that. And let's give her another round of applause. Then we're going to wrap up with you, my friend. There's so many things that define you and so much tremendous work you're doing, but one part of your story is you spent 6 years in the New York State penal system. Talk to us a little bit about that experience and how difficult it was to transition out and how it informs your work today, empowering formerly incarcerated persons as leaders.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. You know, when I went to prison, you know, people assume that if you're engaged in criminal activity, then you have a sense of what you're going to experience when you get to prison. And for me, it was a shock. It wasn't a shock because I got there and I met the animals and wolf packs that we tend to talk about on television. It was a shock because I got there and I met some of America's best and brightest. And I was totally taken aback at the hypocrisy of the system and the fact that it was totally devoid of rehabilitative services. And, you know, that's why I really appreciate the Justice Summit and John Jay and Jeremy Travis and Tina, because they have included the leadership of formerly incarcerated people in a way that doesn't feel like trauma porn. I mean, you had Khalil sitting up here. You had Khalil sitting up here earlier, and clearly while he was telling his story, he was not just telling it articulately, but he was telling it very strategically. And that's what we do at Just Leadership USA. We invest in the very people that have the most interest in the outcome of the decarceration work that we're doing at Just Leadership USA. The toughest moment I had today so far was meeting the mother of Kalief Browder back in the green room and sort of getting down on my knees in front of her and thanking her for her courage, but then telling her that our goal is to shutter Rikers Island, to close down the facility, and to decentralize the jail here in New York City. And she immediately asked me 3 or 4 other questions about how that would happen with an extreme amount of interest. And I'm just blown away that her son's story has gotten to the point where our president is using it as part of the wind beneath his wings to push forward reform. And yet no one has told her that that insidious torture island just off LaGuardia Airport in one of the most progressive cities in America abuses our children. We have 10,220 officers and 9,000 people serving time. Where else in this country, where else in this world do you have that? That jail is an economic engine for this community, and when I talked to over 300 formerly incarcerated leaders before building this organization 14 months ago, almost every single one I spoke to pointed to Rikers Island as a symbol of this sort of institution that helped us to create mass incarceration and continues to cause human carnage. And yet the mayor that we have here in New York City has yet to show the political courage to step up and say that we should close that place down.
Friends, I have often said I wish I had more time, but I've never meant it more than right now. My goodness. Tina, can I have 5 more minutes? The key takeaways, as I've heard them, and we could spend another hour on this, Bruce, understand the importance of trauma and give our kids access to the rhythm and relationships they need to stabilize and emerge as whole. Shirley, know that turnarounds like the ones we saw on the screen can happen if you give communities access to their own leadership and connect the business community as well. And you can find out more about what she's doing at Purpose-Built Communities. Glenn, empowering formerly incarcerated persons as leaders, knowing that they're the best and the brightest, and also shut down Rikers Island, right? Thank you. And Rosie, just that passionate personal story that has led to the transformation that she's seeing every day through arts education, but really just starting with the fact that these kids matter. They're individuals. Their stories matter. And understanding them, learning to know them and to like them first. Yeah, and wrap us up, Rosie. Here we go.
But I really want to say this. We started our organization, Urban Arts Partnership, around 22 years ago. And I have this model that we have been reiterating to the kids, to sponsors, to adults. What separates a child, an underprivileged child, from a privileged child is opportunity. That's it. You give an underprivileged child an opportunity and they will rise to the occasion each and every time, and we see that every single day. It can happen. We can make that change.
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's a great word to close on. Let's start with opportunity at whatever scale you're working on. Let's extend that opportunity to these kids. It's time for lunch. Don't forget to take your stuff. We'll see you in an hour for Dean Strang from Making a Murderer, all right? So we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.